The northern wind carried ash tonight. It always did when Cedric Vale stood trial in his own house. The long table stretched before him like a battlefield frozen in mahogany and silver, lined with 12 lords who'd traveled through snowstorms to tell him he was finished. Candlelight carved their faces into masks of righteous conviction. Outside, Ashenmore Castle groaned under the weight of winter, its black towers clawing at storm clouds that hadn't broken in 3 days. The Duke sat alone at the head of the table, one hand resting near an untouched glass of wine, the other hidden beneath the table where his fingers traced the outline of a loaded pistol. No one had searched him at the door. That was their first mistake. He listened to their accusations with the stillness of a man watching prey stumble into a trap they'd built themselves. And when the senior lord finally demanded his abdication, Cedric smiled the way wolves smile before they feast. This wasn't the beginning of his fall. This was the prologue to theirs. Stay with me until the ending. You'll understand why monsters never die alone. The voice belonged to Lord Harwick, a man whose jowls quivered when he spoke, and whose family fortune came from selling grain during famines at prices that murdered the poor slowly. He read from a scroll like it meant something, like words on parchment could castrate a man who'd learned governance from watching his father choke on kindness. We hereby charge Cedric Aldrich Vale, Duke of Ashenmore, with gross negligence, tyrannical overreach, and willful destruction of diplomatic relations with the crown. Effective immediately, this council demands your voluntary abdication and transfer of authority to... The sound that interrupted him wasn't loud. It was the scrape of Cedric's chair as he stood. Everyone stopped breathing. The Duke moved like winter itself had learned to walk upright. 6 feet 3 inches of controlled violence wrapped in black wool and aristocratic discipline. His coat hung perfectly tailored across shoulders that had carried bodies out of burning buildings during the rebellion that killed half the northern nobility. Scars tracked up his left hand where fire had tried to claim him and failed. His face was carved from the same stone as Ashenmore's foundation, all sharp angles and brutal symmetry, the kind of beauty that made people uneasy because it suggested predation more than grace. His eyes were worse, gray like winter fog, empty of everything except calculation. Continue, Cedric said quietly. It wasn't permission. It was a test. Harwick faltered. The parchment trembled in his grip. Around the table, the other lords shifted in their seats with the nervous energy of men, realizing they'd walked into a cage they couldn't see the walls of yet. Lord Pemberton cleared his throat. The tax levies you've imposed have bankrupted 3 estates. Your refusal to attend the King's Council for 6 consecutive months constitutes open contempt. And your treatment of the Thornfield family and... I burned their estate to the ground, Cedric interrupted. His voice carried no emotion. No defense, just fact delivered like a knife sliding between ribs. They were trafficking children through the eastern ports. I found 17 locked in their wine cellar. Would you prefer I'd written a strongly worded letter instead? Silence crashed through the room. That's not, Pemberton stammered. That's not the point. Then what is the point? Cedric leaned forward, both hands visible now. The pistol still hidden. He studied each lord individually, cataloging fear in eye movements and sweat forming above collars that suddenly felt too tight. You came here tonight believing numbers meant power, 12 against 1, a council's authority versus a single man's defiance. You thought this table would protect you because civilization runs on the illusion that paperwork matters more than violence. He began walking, slowly, behind each chair. Every lord went rigid when he passed. But let me clarify something about power in the north. When the plague hit Keswick 3 winters ago, who organized the quarantine? When the grain stores failed in Blackridge, who prevented the riots? When your children needed protection during the Windsor uprising, whose soldiers bled on your doorsteps while you hid in parlors debating etiquette? His hand touched the back of Lord Harwick's chair. The fat man flinched. Cedric's voice dropped to something barely above a whisper. I don't govern through consent. I govern through competence. You want me gone because I refuse to perform the theater of weakness your politics require. Because I won't pretend diplomacy works on men who only understand consequences. Because every time you look at me, you're reminded that power doesn't flow from votes or birthright. It flows from the willingness to do what you're too frightened to even imagine. He was behind Lord Pemberton now. The old man's hands shook against the table. So here's what happens next. You're going to take your little scroll. You're going to ride back through the storm to whatever comfortable delusion you call leadership. And you're going to explain to the king that the North remains under my authority for the same reason it always has. Cedric stopped at his chair. sat down, picked up the wine glass, because no one else is willing to pay the price it costs. He drank slowly while 12 lords sat frozen in their own impotence. Lord Harwick tried one last time, his voice cracked with desperation, wearing a suit of indignation. The Crown will not tolerate. The Crown is 300 miles south, eating grapes, while peasants burn tax collectors in effigy. The Crown's tolerance is a luxury purchased with northern steel and northern blood. My steel, my blood. If His Majesty has concerns about my methods, he's welcome to ride north and govern this territory himself. I'll even lend him a sword. Cedric set the glass down. But we both know he won't, because kings need men like me to do the ugly work that keeps their hands clean. You don't want justice. You want someone to blame when history judges the violence that built your comfort. The silence that followed was absolute. Outside, wind howled through Ashenmoor's courtyards. Inside, 12 lords discovered what it meant to challenge a man who'd stopped fearing death the same night he watched his younger brother burn alive in a fire set by allies their father had trusted. One by one, they stood. One by one, they left. Lord Harwick paused at the doorway, trying to salvage dignity from wreckage. This isn't over, he said. Cedric didn't look up. It never is. The doors closed. The Duke sat alone at the long table, surrounded by empty chairs and dying candles. His reflection stared back from the dark windows, fractured across glass that hadn't been cleaned since his mother died. He looked older than 36, looked like a man who'd traded decades of life for years of control and was starting to suspect he'd been cheated on both ends of the bargain. A door opened at the far end of the hall. Footsteps. Soft, but certain. Alara Blackwood entered carrying a tray with fresh wine and the kind of silence that came from knowing when words were worse than useless. She'd served House Vale for 20 years, first as his mother's attendant, then as the castle's steward after the old Duke died. Gray streaked her dark hair now, lines mapped the corners of her eyes, but her hands were steady as she poured wine into a clean glass and set it before Cedric without asking if he wanted it. "They're calling you a tyrant in the capital," she said. "Let them. They're saying you've gone too far this time." Cedric looked at her. "Not everyone fears you," Alara continued. "Some just pity you." That cut deeper than she probably intended. He took the wine, drank. "Tell me something," he said. "If you could go back, stop me from becoming this, would you?" Alara studied him with the unsentimental gaze of someone who'd watched him grow from an idealistic boy into whatever he'd become. "No. Why not?" "Because the North would be ashes. Because men like Harwick would have carved this territory into fiefdoms for their idiot sons. Because everything your father built with gentleness would have died with him if you hadn't been willing to defend it with ruthlessness." She picked up the empty tray. "But that doesn't mean you're not still losing something." "What?" "Yourself." The door closed behind her. Cedric sat alone again. He told himself she was wrong, had been telling himself that for 10 years. 3 days later, the letter arrived. It came with the morning dispatches, sealed in blue wax stamped with a crest he didn't recognize. His secretary, a nervous man named Whitmore who organized correspondence like he was defusing bombs, placed it at the top of the stack with trembling fingers. "Your Grace, this one's marked urgent. Personal delivery from London." Cedric broke the seal. Read. Went completely still. Whitmore watched the Duke's face and felt his stomach drop because he'd never seen that expression before. Not anger, not shock. Something colder. Something that looked like a wound recognizing the blade that made it. "Sir?" Cedric set the letter down very carefully. "Find Captain Aldridge. Tell him to prepare an escort to London. Full guard. We leave at dawn." Whitmore hesitated. "May I ask?" "No." The secretary fled. Cedric read the letter again, though he'd already memorized every word. "Duke Vale, your presence is required at the King's winter residence for discussions regarding the Crown's northern interests. Failure to attend will be considered an act of rebellion. A guest suite has been prepared for you and one additional companion. Lord Castellan Edmund Grey." It was a summons dressed as an invitation, a leash hidden inside silk. They were calling him south where their power lived, and his didn't, where politics replaced violence as the weapon of choice, where a man could be destroyed at a dinner party more efficiently than on any battlefield. But that wasn't what made his hands curl into fists against the desk. At the bottom of the letter, written in a different hand, elegant and precise. "I've heard so much about the infamous Duke of Ashenmoor, I'm eager to see if the legend matches the monster. S.E. Serafina Evercott." He knew the name the way soldiers knew the names of battles they'd survived. Daughter of the Evercott family, once among the most powerful noble houses in England until political machinations destroyed them 6 years ago. Her father had been accused of treason on forged evidence. Her mother had died of fever in exile. The family estates were seized, the wealth distributed among rivals, and Serafina herself had vanished into the lower circles of London society, where disgraced nobility went to be forgotten. Caedric had watched it happen, done nothing, because he'd learned by then that survival meant choosing which injustices to fight and which to let consume people too weak to protect themselves. Now she was back, clearly under someone's protection if she was attending court functions, and clearly dangerous if someone thought dangling her name would provoke him into accepting the summons. They were right. Not because he cared about Serafina Evercott, but because whoever was manipulating this situation had done their research, and that meant they understood more about him than they should. Understanding was leverage. Leverage was threat. Captain Aldridge appeared in the doorway an hour later, a veteran soldier who'd followed Caedric through 3 uprisings and understood orders better than questions. 45 years old, built like a siege weapon, scarred across the face from a sword that hadn't quite killed him fast enough. "We're going to London?" "Yes." "Into enemy territory." Caedric looked up from the maps he'd been studying. "Is there any other kind?" The journey south took 4 days. They traveled with 20 armed riders through countryside, still recovering from a winter that had killed livestock and children with equal indifference. Villages appeared and disappeared like ghosts. Smoke rose from chimneys where people burned furniture because firewood cost too much. Eyes watched the Duke's procession from doorways, carrying expressions that mixed fear with the desperate hope that power might notice suffering and give a damn. Caedric never stopped. Couldn't afford to. If he stopped, if he looked too closely at the human cost of every policy decision, every calculated cruelty, every choice he'd made to preserve stability over compassion, then the weight of it might finally crush whatever was left of the boy who'd once believed governance could be both strong and kind. On the second night, they made camp in a forest clearing 20 miles from the estate where his father had been murdered. Caedric stood apart from the fires, watching soldiers eat rations and tell stories that made violence sound like adventure instead of the organized horror it actually was. Captain Aldridge joined him eventually, carrying 2 tin cups of something that claimed to be coffee, but tasted like dirt mixed with regret. "You're thinking about him?" Aldridge said. "Not a question. I'm always thinking about him." They drank in silence. "Your father was a good man," Aldridge finally said. Caedric stared into the darkness beyond the firelight. Good men die betrayed by people they trusted. Good men raise sons who have to become monsters to survive. Good men build kingdoms of hope that collapse the moment ruthlessness arrives with a knife. "You think he'd hate what you've become?" "I know he would." Aldridge considered that. "Maybe. But he'd also be alive to hate it if he'd been more like you. That's not comfort. Wasn't meant to be. Just truth." The captain walked back toward the fires, leaving Caedric alone with ghosts that never stayed buried. His father had ruled Ashenmore with gentleness, had believed in rehabilitation over execution, dialogue over domination, mercy as strength rather than weakness. The northern lords had loved him, right up until the moment they decided his kindness made him expendable. The coup had been surgical. Allies he'd trusted for decades invited him to a summit, poisoned his wine, burned the estate to destroy evidence. Caedric's mother died in the fire. His younger brother Matthias, only 14, burned alive trying to save servants trapped in the East Wing. Caedric survived because he'd been skeptical enough to position soldiers outside. Not enough to prevent the massacre, just enough to escape and launch the counter-rebellion that drowned the North in blood for 2 years. He won, built Ashenmore into something impregnable, and never once let himself forget that his father's greatest virtue had been his fatal flaw. London appeared on the 4th day like a cancer pretending to be civilization. The sprawl of it offended every instinct Caedric had about defensible positions and strategic vulnerability. Too many people crammed into too little space, too much wealth concentrated among parasites who produced nothing. The Thames cut through it like an infected wound, brown and sluggish with the waste of progress. They rode through streets crowded with merchants and beggars and prostitutes and lords, all existing in the same geography while inhabiting completely different worlds. The stench was overwhelming. Shit and smoke and desperation mixed with perfume expensive enough to feed families for months. Ashenmore smelled like pine forests and snow. London smelled like humanity rotting from the inside out. The king's winter residence sat on the northern edge of the city, a sprawling palace complex designed to remind everyone that power lived here, and everywhere else was just borrowed authority waiting to be recalled. Guards in ridiculous uniforms lined the entrance. Servants scurried between buildings carrying messages and wine with equal urgency. Captain Aldridge leaned close as they dismounted. "Watch yourself in there. Politics is a different kind of warfare." Caedric adjusted his coat. "Warfare is warfare. Only the weapons change." They were met by a steward whose smile was so practiced it had stopped being a real expression years ago. He bowed with mechanical precision and led them through corridors decorated with paintings of dead kings and battles that mattered once before becoming tourist attractions for the wealthy. The Duke was shown to a suite that would have housed 20 soldiers comfortably. Excessive furniture. Windows overlooking gardens that probably cost more to maintain than most villages earned in a year. A bed large enough to get lost in. He hated it immediately. "Dinner is at 8, the steward announced. "Lord Castellan Grey requests your presence in the main hall. Formal attire is expected." Cedric looked at him. "I'm wearing formal attire." The steward's smile tightened. "Of course, Your Grace." He left. Captain Aldridge barked orders at the soldiers who'd accompanied them, establishing watch rotations and defensive positions like they were preparing for siege. Cedric stood at the window, watching London sprawl beneath fading sunlight, and wondered which of the 1,000 knives being sharpened in this city was meant for his back. At 7:45, he descended toward the main hall. The corridor was lined with portraits of noble families whose names he recognized from casualty reports and scandal sheets. So much pedigree. So little actual competence. He passed lords and ladies dressed in silk that cost more than his soldiers' annual wages, all performing the elaborate dance of hierarchy that London society called culture. They stared at him, whispered. The northern monster. The tyrant duke. Caedric heard the words and felt nothing. He'd stopped caring about reputation around the same time he'd stopped believing reputation mattered more than results. The main hall was a cathedral to excess. Chandeliers dripping crystal. Tables laden with food that would feed regiments. Musicians playing in the corner, their melodies swallowed by conversation and the clink of champagne glasses. 200 guests minimum, all pretending the carefully orchestrated social warfare happening around them was sophisticated entertainment. Lord Castellan Edmund Grey approached immediately. Tall, silver-haired. The kind of handsome that aged into distinguished rather than decrepit. He moved through crowds like a shark through shallow water, all predatory grace hidden behind diplomatic courtesy. "Duke Vale." His voice carried practiced warmth. "Thank you for accepting our invitation." Caedric met his handshake with enough pressure to communicate understanding. "I don't recall being given a choice." Grey smiled. "Semantics. Come. There are people eager to meet you." He was steered through introductions that blurred together into a parade of names and titles and barely concealed hostility. Everyone wanted to measure the monster, wanted to see if the rumors matched the reality, wanted to find weakness they could exploit later. Cedric gave them nothing, answered questions with precision that revealed nothing substantive, smiled in ways that didn't reach his eyes, played the game he despised because refusing to play would have been tactical stupidity. Then he saw her. She stood near the eastern windows, partially hidden by a marble column, wearing a dress the color of winter twilight, silver-blue fabric that caught light like water moving under ice. Her posture was perfect, but her shoulders carried tension that spoke of survival instincts honed by necessity rather than training. Serafina Evercott. She was staring directly at him, not with fear, with recognition, like she'd been waiting for this moment and had already decided it was going to be a fight. Lord Grey followed his gaze and smiled. "Ah, yes, Lady Serafina, a remarkable young woman. Quite the tragic history, as I'm sure you're aware." Caedric said nothing. "She's under my mentorship now," Grey continued, "helping her reestablish the family name. Perhaps you'd like an introduction." It wasn't a question. They crossed the hall together. Serafina watched them approach with the stillness of someone who'd learned to hide panic behind composure. Up close, Caedric could see details the distance had concealed. The faint scar above her left eyebrow. The way her hand stayed visible, never hidden in folds of her dress, like she'd learned not to give people reason to suspect concealed weapons. Eyes the color of storm clouds, carrying the kind of intelligence that came from being underestimated her entire life. "Lady Serafina," Grey said smoothly, "may I present Duke Caedric Vale of Ashenmore?" She curtsied. Perfectly executed, completely insincere. "Your Grace." Her voice carried acid wrapped in silk. "Your reputation precedes you." Caedric studied her. As does yours. Oh? She tilted her head slightly. I wasn't aware disgraced daughters warranted reputations. You're here. That means someone finds you useful. How pragmatic. Is that how you measure people? By utility? By survival. Something flickered behind her eyes. Respect, maybe? Or recognition of a shared wound. I've heard you rule the North through fear, she said. I rule the North through competence. Fear is just how people interpret strength they don't understand. And mercy? Where does that fit in your philosophy? Mercy is what the strong pretend exists to feel better about their advantages. Seraphina smiled. It wasn't pleasant, how perfectly monstrous. Caedric felt something shift in his chest. Not attraction, not yet, but awareness. The kind that made predators circle each other, testing boundaries, measuring threat potential. Lord Grey was watching them both with the expression of someone who'd just set pieces on a board and was pleased with the opening moves. I'll leave you two to get acquainted, he said, and disappeared into the crowd. They stood alone together in the middle of 200 people. Seraphina spoke first. You could have stopped them. Who? The people who destroyed my family. You had the power even then. Northern alliances, military control. One word from you and the forgery would have been exposed. Caedric didn't deny it. I had more pressing concerns, like consolidating your own authority. Yes. She looked at him like he'd just confirmed every terrible thing she'd heard. You let innocent people burn to protect your position. I let everyone burn who wasn't essential to stability. Your family, my allies, anyone who became a liability. That's what governance actually costs. And you sleep fine? No, but I survive, which is more than most people manage. Seraphina stepped closer. Her voice dropped low enough that only he could hear. You think brutality makes you strong, but all it makes you is lonely. I've watched you tonight, seen how everyone keeps distance, not just from fear, from revulsion. You've built a kingdom where no one can reach you and convinced yourself that's victory. The accuracy of it hit harder than any weapon. Caedric's jaw tightened. Better lonely than dead. Better isolated than betrayed. I learned that watching my father's allies poison his wine. She didn't flinch. My father died believing the system would vindicate him. That truth mattered. That justice existed. He was wrong about all of it. So don't lecture me about naivety. I understand ruthlessness. I just choose not to worship it. Then you'll die like he did, maybe. But at least I'll die human. The music swelled around them. Conversations continued. London's aristocracy performed its nightly ritual of civilized barbarism. Caedric and Seraphina stood locked in mutual recognition of damage neither wanted to admit. Finally, he spoke. Why are you really here? Lord Grey's patronage, she said. He offered protection in exchange for social rehabilitation. I needed allies. He needed a symbol of redemption. Mutually beneficial arrangement. You don't trust him, not even slightly. Smart, she studied him. Are you going to warn me away from whatever scheme he's planning? No. Why not? Because you already know, and because warning you would imply I care if you survive it. Seraphina laughed, bitter and bright. God, you really are exactly what they say you are. Worse, Caedric said. The evening continued in excruciating monotony. Dinner was served across multiple courses designed to demonstrate wealth through excess. Speeches were given by men whose authority came from inheritance rather than competence. Caedric endured it with the mechanical precision of someone performing a role he'd perfected years ago. But his attention kept returning to Seraphina. She moved through this crowd with practiced ease, charming lords and deflecting advances with the skill of someone who'd learned to weaponize courtesy. Every smile calculated, every word measured. She was performing survival the same way he was, just with different tools. They were seated near each other at dinner, Lord Grey's arrangement, obviously intentional. The man across from them was Lord Pemberton, one of the 12 who'd tried to remove Caedric 3 days earlier. He looked deeply uncomfortable having to share a table with the Duke he'd attempted to depose. Duke Vale, Pemberton tried. I hope there are no hard feelings about the Council's concerns. Caedric cut his meat with surgical precision. I don't have feelings about insects. Seraphina made a sound that might have been a suppressed laugh. Pemberton went red. That's unnecessarily hostile. No. Unnecessary would be listing the specific ways you failed your constituents while enriching yourself through grain speculation. Hostile would be doing something about it. Pemberton stammered. I won't be spoken to. Then leave. The Lord stood, fled. Serafina leaned slightly closer. You enjoy that. What? Watching them break. Cadric met her eyes. You disapprove. I understand it. Doesn't mean I approve. What would you do differently? Make them fear the consequences of their actions instead of fearing you. One creates temporary compliance. The other creates actual change. Idealistic. Practical. Your way requires constant enforcement. The moment you're gone, everything collapses. Then I won't be gone. Everyone's gone eventually. The truth of that sat between them like a third presence at the table. After dinner, guests dispersed into smaller groups for cards, smoking, and the kind of intimate conversations where real power changed hands. Cadric extracted himself from a cluster of sycophants and found a balcony overlooking the gardens. The night air was cold, cleaner than the perfumed atmosphere inside. He heard footsteps behind him and didn't turn. Following me, Lady Serafina? She joined him at the railing, escaping the same insufferable performance you are. They stood in silence. London spread before them, lights twinkling like promises that would never be kept. Tell me something, she said eventually. Do you ever regret it? What? Becoming this. Whatever you are now. Cadric considered the question. Every day. But you won't change. No. Why not? Because the alternative is worse. Because someone has to be willing to make the decisions that keep civilization from eating itself. Because mercy killed my family, and I won't let sentiment kill what they died building. Serafina looked at him. Your brother. Matthias. He was 14? Cadric went very still. How do you know about Matthias? I read. Pay attention. Your father's coup is well documented in circles that care about northern politics. He burned alive trying to save servants. I know. He was good. Like our father. Believed people were fundamentally decent if you gave them chance after chance after chance. Serafina's voice softened. And you think that's what killed him? I know that's what killed him. Kindness is a luxury purchased with other people's blood. They stood in silence again. Then Serafina spoke words that would haunt him for months. You're wrong about mercy. It's not weakness. It's the hardest form of strength because it requires believing people can be better than their worst moments. Your father wasn't naive. He was brave. And you're not strong for rejecting that. You're just scared. Cadric turned to face her fully. His voice came out colder than he intended. You think you understand me because we've both survived trauma, but you don't. I'm not interested in your psychological analysis or your philosophical debates about governance. I came here because I was summoned. I'll play whatever game Lord Grey is orchestrating. And when it's done, I'll return north and continue doing what I've always done. Which is surviving, no matter what it costs. Serafina held his gaze. Even if it costs your humanity? I lost that years ago. She studied him for a long moment, then shook her head slowly. No, you didn't. If you had, we wouldn't be having this conversation. You wouldn't care enough to defend yourself. The fact that you're angry means some part of you still remembers what it felt like to be something other than a monster. Get away from me. Cadric, get away from me before I say something we'll both regret. Serafina stood her ground. You don't scare me. You should be terrified. Why? Because you're dangerous? Because you've done terrible things? I've spent 6 years navigating a world that wanted me destroyed for sins I didn't commit. I've been propositioned by lords old enough to be my grandfather. I've been threatened with arrest for breathing incorrectly in the wrong aristocrat's presence. I've survived by being smarter and harder and more ruthless than anyone expected a disgraced daughter to be capable of. So no, Duke Vale. Your reputation doesn't frighten me. Your isolation does. What does that mean? It means I recognize what you're doing because I've done it too. Built walls so high no one can hurt you. Convinced yourself that alone is safer than vulnerable. Turned cruelty into armor because tenderness got people killed. But eventually those walls become a prison, and you wake up realizing you've successfully protected yourself from everything, including the possibility of being human. Her words cut through defenses he'd spent a decade building. Cadric felt something crack in his chest, something he thought was dead. Who are you? He asked quietly. Serafina smiled sadly. Someone who wishes we'd met before we both became this broken. She walked back inside, left him alone on the balcony. Cadric stood there for a long time, staring at nothing, feeling the weight of 10 years of calculated violence press against ribs that suddenly felt too fragile to contain everything he'd locked inside. When he finally returned to his suite hours later, Captain Aldridge was waiting with a report. 2 attempts to access your room. Both intercepted. One was a servant who claimed to be delivering fresh linens at midnight. The other was a lord's attaché who said he had urgent correspondence from the northern estates. Both lies. Obviously. Where are they now? Detained in the servants' quarters, awaiting your orders. Kedrick sat heavily in a chair that cost more than most people earned in a lifetime. Let them go. Aldridge frowned. Sir? They were sent to test our defenses. Killing them accomplishes nothing except confirming we're paranoid. Let them report back that we're alert, but not hostile. Makes the next attempt more predictable. Understood. The captain left. Kedrick sat alone in opulent imprisonment, replaying the conversation with Serafina, hating how accurately she'd seen through him, hating more that part of him wanted to be seen. Sleep didn't come. It rarely did anymore. Around 3 in the morning, exhaustion finally dragged him under, and he dreamed of fire. Of his brother screaming, of his father's body slumped at a table, of graves he'd filled with people who'd made the mistake of being weak when the world demanded strength. He woke at dawn, drenched in sweat, gasping. The day unfolded with brutal routine, meetings with ministers who wanted northern resources, negotiations with merchants seeking trade access, conversations with military officials who resented his authority but needed his troops. Every interaction was warfare disguised as diplomacy. Kedrick played it perfectly, gave nothing, took everything he could, but his mind kept returning to Serafina's words about isolation and humanity and the prison he'd built from ruthlessness. That evening, Lord Grey summoned him for a private dinner, just the 3 of them. Grey, Kedrick, Serafina. The dining room was smaller, more intimate, designed for conversations that couldn't happen in public. Grey sat at the head of the table, playing host with the smooth confidence of someone who controlled the board. Serafina sat to his left, guarded and watchful. Kedrick sat to his right, counting exits and cataloging potential weapons within reach. Duke Vale, Grey began after servants had poured wine and retreated. I wanted to discuss the northern territories more candidly than public forums allow. Discuss or negotiate? Grey smiled. Both. You've done remarkable work stabilizing a region that most considered ungovernable. The Crown appreciates your effectiveness, but your methods have created concern. Fear is a powerful tool, but it's also volatile. The king worries about succession, about what happens when you're gone and there's no institutional structure to maintain order. Kedrick sipped wine. Sounds like a problem for whoever comes after me. We'd prefer to avoid the chaos entirely, which is why I'm proposing a partnership. Go on. The Crown wants to formalize your authority, make it hereditary. Establish Ashenmore as a duchy with guaranteed autonomy in exchange for annual tribute and military support during royal conflicts. Kedrick set his glass down. You want to legitimize my power while simultaneously ensuring I'm dependent on Crown approval. I want to protect your legacy while bringing the North back into alignment with national interests. And what do you want, Lord Grey? The question hung in the air. Grey's expression didn't change, but something shifted behind his eyes. I want stability, prosperity, a kingdom where power flows through proper channels instead of being held hostage by strongmen who refuse to compromise. So you want to domesticate me. I want to ensure your effectiveness outlasts your lifespan. Serafina had been silent throughout the exchange. Now she spoke. And where do I fit in this arrangement? Both men turned to look at her. Grey's smile widened. Excellent question. Lady Serafina represents an opportunity. Her family name still carries weight among certain circles. Her rehabilitation would demonstrate the Crown's commitment to justice and redemption, and a marriage alliance between House Evercott and House Vale would unite northern military power with southern diplomatic influence. The room went completely silent. Kedrick stared at Grey like he'd just suggested ritual suicide. Serafina looked equally stunned. You're proposing, she said slowly, that I marry him. I'm proposing a strategic partnership that benefits everyone involved. The Duke gains political legitimacy and an heir. You regain your family's status and protection. The Crown secures northern stability through formal alliance. Kedrick's voice came out flat. Absolutely not. Why not? Grey asked pleasantly. You need a wife eventually, preferably one intelligent enough to manage the social aspects of governance you openly despise. And Serafina needs protection from the many lords who still consider her family's assets worth claiming through marriage. Because, Serafina interrupted, we can't stand each other. Actually, Grey said, That makes you perfect. You're both too pragmatic to confuse marriage with romance, too damaged to expect comfort. You could build something functional instead of sentimental. Isn't that more honest than the performance most noble marriages require? Kedrick stood abruptly. This conversation is over. Duke Vale, I said it's over. He walked out, left them both sitting at the table. His mind was racing. The marriage proposal wasn't about alliance. It was about control. Gray wanted to tie him to the court through Serafina, wanted to create leverage that could be used to moderate his independence. And Serafina was either complicit or being used as bait. Either way, it was a trap. He made it halfway down the corridor before footsteps caught up to him. Serafina. Wait! He kept walking. She grabbed his arm. He spun, ready to snap something vicious, but stopped when he saw her face. She looked furious. Not at him. At the situation. I didn't know, she said, about the marriage proposal. He never mentioned it before tonight. You expect me to believe that. I don't care what you believe. I'm telling you the truth. Gray has been orchestrating something, but I thought it was political positioning. Not this. Kedrick studied her, looking for deception, finding only anger that mirrored his own. Either way, the answer is no. Obviously. I'd rather throw myself in the Thames. They stood in the empty corridor. Then Serafina laughed, bitter and exhausted. God, we're both so fucked. Despite everything, Kedrick felt his mouth twitch toward something that might have been a smile. Gray won't give up easily. No. He thinks he owns me. That because he saved me from poverty, I owe him whatever he decides I'm worth. You don't strike me as someone who accepts ownership quietly. I'm not, but I also don't have unlimited options. The world isn't kind to disgraced women without protection. Kedrick made a decision he didn't fully understand. Return to the north with me. What? When I leave, come with me. Not as a wife, as, I don't know, something else. You need distance from Gray. I need someone who isn't terrified of me. We can figure out the details later. Serafina stared at him. That's insane. Probably. Why would you offer that? Because you were right. About the isolation. And because maybe having someone around who calls me monstrous to my face would be better than being surrounded by people who lie. She considered it. You're serious? Yes. This isn't some elaborate scheme? If I wanted to manipulate you, I'd be better at it. Fair point. Serafina looked toward the dining room where Gray was probably plotting their next move. Then back at Kedrick. All right, she said. But I have conditions. Of course you do. I'm not some decoration. If I come north, I want actual authority. Involvement in governance decisions. Not just social performance. Agreed. And if you try to control me the way you control everyone else, I'll burn Ashenmoor to the ground myself. Noted. And you have to actually try. To be something other than the monster everyone thinks you are. Kedrick met her eyes. I can't promise that. Then promise you'll try to try. He felt that crack in his chest widen slightly. Fine. I'll try to try. Serafina extended her hand. Partners in survival. Kedrick shook it. Partners in survival. They stood in the corridor, two people who'd been destroyed by circumstances beyond their control, making a pact that would either save them both or guarantee mutual destruction. Neither knew which. Neither cared. Because for the first time in years, neither of them felt quite so alone. But as they walked back toward their respective quarters, neither noticed the figure watching from the shadows at the end of the hall. Lord Gray's assistant. A thin man whose entire existence revolved around observing things people wanted hidden. He disappeared into the darkness, headed straight for his master. And by morning, the entire court would know that the Northern Monster and the disgraced daughter had formed an alliance, which meant the real game was just beginning. The news spread through London's court like poison through water. By breakfast, every noble with eyes and ears knew that Duke Kedrick Vale had been seen in private conversation with Lady Serafina Evercott. By mid-morning, the rumors had evolved into something more dangerous. By noon, 3 separate lords had approached Lord Grey, demanding to know if the disgraced Evercott daughter was being positioned as the Northern Monster's bride. Grey smiled at each inquiry and said nothing, which confirmed everything. Kedrick discovered the damage during a meeting with the King's Trade Minister, a sweating bureaucrat named Donovan who kept glancing toward the door like he expected assassination at any moment. Your Grace, the matter of grain exports from the Northern Territories requires immediate attention. The Crown has concerns about supply stability given recent developments. Kedrick leaned back in his chair. What developments? Donovan wiped his forehead. Your potential marriage alliance with House Evercott. Several lords feel this represents a consolidation of power that might threaten existing trade agreements. I'm not marrying anyone. The minister blinked. But Lord Grey said, Lord Grey is speculating. I make my own decisions about marriage the same way I make decisions about grain exports, without permission. Then you're not engaged to Lady Seraphina? No, but you were seen speaking privately with her. Multiple times. Cadrick's voice went cold. Is conversation illegal now? Of course not, Your Grace. It's just that, given her family's history and your position, people are naturally concerned about the implications, so let me clarify the implications. I'll speak to whoever I want. I'll form alliances with whoever serves northern interests. And if anyone has concerns about that, they're welcome to ride north and discuss it with me personally, preferably armed. Donovan went pale. That won't be necessary. Good. Are we done here? Yes, Your Grace. The minister fled. Caedric sat alone in the meeting room, calculating the speed at which Grey had weaponized a single conversation into political leverage. It was efficient, ruthless, exactly what he would have done if positions were reversed, which meant he'd underestimated the man. Mistake. He found Seraphina in the palace library, hidden among shelves that smelled like old leather and forgotten knowledge. She was reading something ancient, her finger tracing text like she was decoding secrets the author had buried between words. We have a problem, Kedrick said. She didn't look up. Just one? Gray's spreading rumors about an engagement. By tomorrow, half of London will believe we're planning a wedding. By next week, it'll be assumed fact. Seraphina closed the book. Let me guess. You stormed into meetings denying everything which only made people more suspicious. How did you know? Because that's what I would have done. She finally looked at him. We're both too confrontational for politics. It's going to get us killed. So what do we do? Stop denying it. Cadrick stared at her. You want to confirm false rumors about our engagement? No. I want to control the narrative before Gray does. Right now, everyone thinks we're his puppets dancing to whatever scheme he's orchestrated. We take ownership of the story. We steal his leverage by pretending to be engaged, by being strategically ambiguous. We don't confirm. We don't deny. We let people speculate while we figure out what Gray's actually planning. That's insane. Seraphina stood smoothing her dress. You offered me protection last night. This is what protection looks like when you're fighting people who weaponize reputation. We play the game or we get played. She was right. He hated that she was right. Fine. But we establish rules, obviously. She started counting on her fingers. 1, this is tactical only. No actual romance. 2, we maintain separate quarters and lives. 3, the moment this stops serving both our interests, it ends. 4, you don't touch me without permission. 5, I get full transparency about northern governance if I'm going to be associated with your reputation. Kedrick considered. Agreed on all counts. But I have conditions too. You don't interfere with security decisions. You don't contradict me publicly. And if this falls apart, you don't become a liability I have to manage. Meaning, you won't kill me if it's politically convenient. Meaning, I won't betray you the way your family was betrayed. Despite what you think, I don't murder people for convenience, just for necessity. Yes, they stood among books written by dead authors who'd thought words could change the world and had been proven catastrophically wrong. Partners in survival, Seraphina said quietly. Partners in survival. The shift happened immediately. That afternoon, when Caedric attended a reception for military officials, Seraphina appeared at his side, not clinging to his arm like a decoration, walking beside him like an equal. She engaged commanders in conversations about supply logistics that demonstrated she'd actually studied northern military structure, asked questions that were sharp enough to make people reconsider dismissing her as just another noble daughter playing at relevance. The effect was immediate. People started watching them differently, not as predator and victim, as alliance. Lord Grey noticed. Of course he noticed. That evening, he found Caedric on the same balcony where the Duke had spoken with Seraphina 2 nights earlier. You're cleverer than I gave you credit for, Grey said. Caedric didn't turn. Am I? Seizing the narrative. Turning my proposal into your strategy? It's bold, reckless, but bold. I didn't seize anything. Lady Seraphina and I are exploring mutual interests. Of course you are. Grey joined him at the railing. But you should know that exploration has consequences. There are men in this court who wanted Serafina vulnerable, who saw her disgrace as opportunity. Your protection makes her valuable again, which makes her dangerous. To whom? To everyone who benefits from the Evercott estates remaining in legal limbo. To families who've claimed portions of her inheritance. To lords who wanted her desperate enough to accept unfavorable marriage arrangements. Cedric finally looked at him. You're one of those men. Gray smiled. I'm all of those men. I orchestrated her social rehabilitation precisely because it gave me leverage over her choices. But you've complicated that by offering an alternative. So this conversation is a warning. This conversation is clarity. You can protect Lady Serafina. You have the military power and northern authority to make most threats irrelevant. But protection requires commitment. Half measures will just get her killed while making you look weak. And you're hoping I'm not willing to commit. I'm hoping you're pragmatic enough to recognize when sentiment becomes liability. She's a remarkable woman, intelligent, resilient. But she's also a symbol of every failed idealistic impulse your father represented. If you tie yourself to that symbol, you're declaring that mercy matters more than strength. Kedrick's voice went quiet. You're scared. Excuse me? You're scared that I might actually be changing, that the monster you thought you understood is becoming unpredictable. That frightens you more than my ruthlessness ever did, because predictable threats can be managed. Gray's smile tightened. You're projecting. Am I? Or are you realizing you've lost control of the situation and now you're trying to manipulate me back into the box you built? They stared at each other, two apex predators circling. Finally, Gray spoke. The king wants to see you tomorrow. Private audience. Just you. About what? Your future. The North's future. The question of whether a man like you can be trusted with generational power. Sounds like a threat. It's an opportunity. To prove you're more than the butcher of Ashenmore. Gray walked away, left Cedric alone with the growing certainty that he'd just declared war on one of the most dangerous political operators in England. The private audience with King Edward happened in a chamber designed to intimidate. High ceilings. Portraits of monarchs who'd executed dukes for lesser defiance. Windows that looked out over London's sprawl like a reminder of the scale of power Cedric was challenging. The king sat in a chair that wasn't quite a throne but communicated the same authority. 56 years old. Soft around the middle from years of indulgence. But his eyes were sharp, calculating. The eyes of a man who'd survived court politics by knowing when to appear weak and when to reveal the knife. Duke Vale. His voice carried practiced warmth. Thank you for attending. Cedric bowed. Correctly, but without subservience. Your Majesty, sit, please. They sat across from each other while servants poured wine and retreated like ghosts. The king studied him. You're younger than I expected. My advisors speak of you like you're some ancient warlord, but you're what, 36? Yes. And you've held the North for how long? 10 years. 10 years? Edward sipped his wine. That's remarkable considering the region's history of instability. Your father struggled for decades to maintain even marginal control. Yet you've created something approaching order, through methods my father would have found abhorrent. The king smiled. Yes, I've read the reports. Mass executions, forced relocations, property seizures. You govern like you're at war. I am at war. Just not the kind with clear battle lines. Every day is combat between order and chaos, between the people who build civilization and the ones who tear it apart for profit. And you see yourself as the builder. I see myself as the only person willing to do what's necessary. Edward set his glass down. That's what concerns me. The certainty. The belief that your judgment is infallible. Do you know what happens to leaders who stop questioning themselves? They survive longer than the ones who doubt every decision, or they become tyrants. The word hung between them. Cedric didn't flinch. Is that what you think I am? I think you're a man who's confused effectiveness with righteousness, who's mistaken fear for respect, and who's dangerous precisely because you're competent enough to make brutality look like governance. Then remove me. Send your armies north. See how well they fare against soldiers who actually believe in what they're defending. The king laughed, a genuine sound that carried no warmth. You think I'm threatening you? I'm not. I'm trying to understand you, because Lord Grey wants you destroyed. Half my council wants you arrested. But I'm wondering if you might be useful. Cedric went very still. How? The realm needs men who aren't paralyzed by compassion, who can make hard decisions without drowning in guilt. You've proven you're capable of that. But capability without constraint is just barbarism with better organization. So you want to constrain me. I want to channel you, give your ruthlessness purpose beyond self-preservation, make you part of something larger than your personal trauma. And in exchange, recognition, protection, the knowledge that your authority comes from the crown rather than just military intimidation. Your children would inherit the duchy legally. Your legacy would be secured. Cedric stood. I don't need your permission to govern. No, but you need my tolerance, and that tolerance ends the moment you become more dangerous to me than you are useful. They stared at each other, king and duke. The fight wasn't physical, but it was happening all the same. I'll consider your offer, Cedric finally said. Do. And Duke Vale? Yes? Lady Seraphina Evercott. Is she important to you? The question felt like a trap. She's under my protection. That's not what I asked. Cedric met the king's gaze. She's someone who understands the cost of survival. That makes her valuable in ways most people aren't. Edward nodded slowly. Then protect her carefully. Because the moment she becomes leverage against you, she becomes a target. And I won't intervene to save someone who's already been weaponized. The audience ended. Cedric left feeling like he'd just survived a battle fought entirely with words. He found Seraphina in the gardens, sitting on a stone bench beneath trees that had witnessed centuries of political scheming. She looked up when he approached, read something in his expression, and made room beside her. The king? Yes. How bad? He offered me legitimacy in exchange for obedience. And you said? Nothing useful. She almost smiled. So typical. They sat in silence. Afternoon light filtered through branches, creating patterns on cobblestones that shifted whenever wind moved the leaves. We should leave, Seraphina said. Return north before this gets worse. It's already worse. Gray's maneuvering for something. The king wants to control me. And half the court sees you as either opportunity or threat. Then we need allies. We have each other. She looked at him. That's not enough. It'll have to be. Seraphina shook her head. You don't understand how this works. Political isolation is fatal. Your military strength protects you in the north, but here you're vulnerable. One coordinated effort, and you'll be arrested for treason before you can mobilize a response. Then what do you suggest? Find the fractures. The nobles who hate Gray. The ministers who resent the king's favoritism. The military commanders who remember your father and respected him. Build a coalition fast enough that destroying you becomes too costly. That's your area of expertise. Not mine. Exactly. Which is why you need me as more than just symbolic protection. Cedric studied her. You've been planning this. Since the moment you offered to take me north, I don't do anything without calculating 3 moves ahead. Survival skill. We're more alike than I thought. I know, it's disturbing. They sat together, 2 people who'd learned to trust no one, slowly beginning to trust each other because the alternative was isolation that would kill them both. That night, everything changed. The assassination attempt came during a ball celebrating some duke's birthday, the kind of event where hundreds of people gathered to perform wealth and status while pretending they enjoyed each other's company. Cedric attended because refusing would have been noticed. Seraphina accompanied him because her absence would have raised questions about their supposed alliance. They moved through crowds that parted like water around stones. Conversations happened around them, laughter that sounded forced, music that was technically perfect and emotionally vacant. Then Captain Aldridge appeared. His face carried the expression of a man who'd just discovered imminent danger and was calculating response time. He leaned close to Cedric. We have a problem. Where? Everywhere. I've spotted 4 individuals who don't match their stated identities. Ex-military bearing, positioned at strategic points around the ballroom. They're not here for dancing. Assassins, most likely. Cedric's mind went cold. The calculation happened instantly. Too public for open attack. They'd need to isolate him, draw him away from crowds, probably using Seraphina as bait or distraction. Where is she? Aldridge looked around. Dancing with Lord Pemberton. Far side of the ballroom, Cedric scanned the crowd. Found her. Watched as Pemberton led her toward the balcony doors under the pretense of getting air. Every instinct screamed trap. He moved, not running. That would create panic. But walking with the kind of purpose that made people step aside without understanding why. Aldridge followed, hand near his concealed weapon. They reached the balcony just as Pemberton was guiding Seraphina outside. Cedric's voice cut through the music. Lord Pemberton! The man jumped. Your Grace, I was just... She's staying inside. Pemberton's face went pale. I assure you, we were only... Now. The Lord practically ran back into the ballroom. Seraphina looked at Cadric with confusion, turning to understanding. They were going to kill you. Yes. Using me as bait. Probably. She glanced past him toward the ballroom. How many? At least 4, maybe more. Then we're trapped. No, we're adapting. Cadric turned to Aldridge. How many men do we have inside? 6, plus myself. Against an unknown number of trained assassins in a room full of civilians. He did the math. Saw no version that ended without blood. Unless... He looked at Seraphina. Can you create a scene? What kind of scene? The kind that gets everyone's attention. Makes it impossible for anyone to move without being noticed. She understood immediately. Something dramatic. Very. Seraphina took a breath, smiled in a way that made Cadric nervous. Then she walked back into the ballroom, climbed onto a chair, and started screaming. Everyone froze. This man, she pointed at Cadric, is trying to kidnap me. He's planning to force me into marriage and steal my family's remaining estates. Someone help me. Please, he's a monster. The ballroom erupted into chaos. Nobles rushed toward her. Ladies gasped. Men shouted. The entire careful social structure collapsed into confusion. And in that confusion, 4 men near the exits moved wrong. Reached for weapons. Aldridge saw it first. Moved faster. His blade took the nearest assassin in the throat before anyone realized what was happening. Then the violence became visible. Screaming got louder. Real now. People stampeded toward the exits. The other 3 assassins tried to fight through the crowd toward Cadric, but found themselves trapped by panicking nobility. Cadric's soldiers moved with surgical precision. 2 more assassins went down. The 4th managed to fire a pistol. The shot was deafening in the enclosed space. The bullet hit someone. Not Cadric. Not Seraphina. Lord Grey. He went down hard, blood spreading across his pristine coat. The assassin tried to reload. Aldridge put a sword through his back. Silence crashed over the ballroom. Everyone stared at the bodies, at the blood, at Lord Grey gasping on the marble floor. Cadric crossed the space, knelt beside him. Grey looked up with eyes that were already fading. His voice came out wet. You think you've won. I think you tried to have me killed and failed. Grey coughed. Blood appeared at the corner of his mouth. Wasn't me. Bigger than me. Always bigger. Who? The Lord smiled. Dying but still manipulating. Ask her. She knows. His eyes went empty. Cadric stood, looked across the ballroom at Seraphina. She was staring at Grey's body with an expression he couldn't read. Fear, maybe. Or recognition. The king's guards arrived within minutes. Took statements. Collected bodies. Looked at Cadric like they couldn't decide if he was victim or criminal. The senior guard, a captain named Thorne, studied the scene. 4 assassins, all dead. 1 lord murdered. And you're claiming self-defense. I'm not claiming anything. The evidence speaks for itself. The evidence shows 4 men with weapons and 1 extremely convenient performance by Lady Seraphina that created chaos at precisely the right moment. Cadric's voice went cold. Are you accusing us of orchestrating this? I'm suggesting the situation is suspicious. That perhaps Lord Grey wasn't the target. That perhaps someone wanted him dead and used the cover of an assassination attempt to eliminate him. Then you're an idiot. Grey was my enemy, but he was useful. I don't kill useful enemies unless they become immediate threats. And did he? Cadric didn't answer. The captain looked at Seraphina. Lady Evercott. Care to explain why you accused Duke Vale of kidnapping? She met his gaze without flinching. Because he told me to create a distraction. Because there were men with weapons moving toward us. Because I trusted his judgment over my comfort, convenient, survival. Thorne sighed. You're both coming with me. The king wants answers, and he wants them tonight. They were separated immediately. Cadric was taken to a holding room that wasn't quite a cell, but communicated the same message. Stone walls, 1 door, no windows. A chair and table that looked designed for interrogation. Captain Aldridge was somewhere else. His soldiers detained. The careful structure of protection he'd built collapsing now that they were inside enemy territory with no clear escape. He sat alone for 2 hours, calculating, planning, understanding that he'd just survived 1 assassination attempt only to walk into a political execution dressed as investigation. When the door finally opened, it wasn't guards. It was the king. Edward entered alone. Closed the door. Studied Cadric with an expression that mixed curiosity and calculation. Tell me the truth. I already did. Tell me what Gray meant when he said it was bigger than him. That she knows. Cadric stayed silent. The king sat across from him. 4 men tried to kill you tonight. They failed. But in the process, one of my most powerful lords died under circumstances that make you look either incompetent or guilty. Do you understand the position that puts me in? You think I orchestrated Gray's death, did you? No. But I'm not sorry he's dead. Edward leaned back. At least you're honest about that. But honesty doesn't solve my problem. Half the court believes you're a murderer. The other half believes you're incompetent enough to let assassins operate freely. Either way, your authority is compromised. Then arrest me. See what happens when you try to hold the Duke of Ashenmore on fabricated charges. Not fabricated. Questionable. There's a difference. Kedrick leaned forward. You want to know what Gray meant? Fine. He was protecting something, someone. A conspiracy that wanted me dead but needed plausible deniability. He hired those men but made sure there were layers between himself and them. When it failed, he knew exposure was inevitable, so he tried to make me look guilty instead. And Lady Seraphina is exactly what she appears to be. Someone caught between powerful men playing games with her life. The king studied him. You care about her. It wasn't a question. Kedrick said nothing. Edward stood. I'm releasing you, both of you, because keeping you here starts a war I don't need. But Duke Vale? Yes? If I discover you're lying, if I find evidence you orchestrated Lord Gray's death or manipulated tonight's events, I will destroy you, your lands, your legacy, everything. Do you understand? Perfectly. Good. Get out of my city. Take Lady Seraphina. Go back to your frozen wasteland and govern it however you like. But don't come back, because next time I won't be merciful. Cadric stood, bowed, left. Found Seraphina waiting in the corridor outside. She looked exhausted, shaken, but intact. Are we leaving? She asked. Immediately. Good. I hate London. 8. They walked through corridors still stained with tonight's violence. Servants were cleaning blood off marble. Guards watched them pass with expressions that mixed fear and resentment. Outside, dawn was breaking over the city. Captain Aldridge had already organized their escort. 20 soldiers on horseback, supplies loaded, weapons visible. They mounted without speaking, rode toward the north gate while London woke around them. Halfway through the city, Seraphina pulled her horse alongside Cadric's. We need to talk. Later. No. Now. What Gray said before he died. I know. She stared at him. You know? That you're hiding something. That whatever conspiracy wanted me dead involves you somehow. Yes. I know. And you're not demanding answers. Kedrick looked at her. You'll tell me when you're ready. Or you won't. Either way, we're riding north together because the alternative is leaving you here to face whatever's coming next alone. Seraphina's eyes went bright with something that might have been tears. Why would you do that? Because I made a promise. Partners in survival. That means I don't abandon you the first time things get complicated. Even if I'm dangerous? Especially then. They rode in silence for another hour. Then Seraphina spoke quietly. My father, before he died. He was investigating financial corruption at the highest levels of government. Embezzlement, bribery, treason hidden behind legitimate trade. He found evidence that implicated dozens of lords, ministers, even members of the royal family. And they killed him for it. They destroyed him legally first, made him look like the criminal so no one would believe his accusations. Then they killed him when exile wasn't enough to silence him. Where's the evidence? I have it. Hidden. Distributed across locations only I know. That's why Gray wanted you controlled. Why the marriage proposal? You're not just a symbol of redemption. You're a threat. Yes. Cadric processed that. Then asked the question that would define everything. Are you planning to use it? Seraphina looked toward the horizon where northern forests were starting to appear. I was. That's why I accepted Gray's patronage. I was going to rebuild my reputation, gain access to the right circles, then expose everyone who destroyed my family. And now? Now I'm wondering if revenge is worth the cost. If dragging down dozens of powerful men will change anything or just create more orphans like me. That's your choice, not mine. She glanced at him. What would you do? Burn them all. Without hesitation. But I'm not a good person to model decisions after. Seraphina smiled sadly. Maybe that's exactly why I'm asking. They rode north. Behind them, London faded into distance. Ahead, Ashenmore waited like a fortress built from everything both of them were trying to escape and everything they'd become to survive. The journey took 6 days. They spoke little during daylight. At night, camps were established with military precision. Soldiers rotated watch. Fires were kept small. On the third night, Serafina found Carriage standing alone beyond the firelight, staring at nothing. "Can't sleep?" she asked. "Never can." "Me neither." They stood in silence. Then Serafina spoke. "I saw you. During the attack. You didn't hesitate. Didn't freeze. Just moved like violence was a language you'd spoken your entire life. It is. That's what frightens me. Not that you're capable of it, that you're comfortable with it." Carriage looked at her. "Would you prefer I was bad at violence? That when people tried to kill us, I fumbled and got us both murdered? No, I just wonder what it costs." "Being that way. Everything. It costs everything." Serafina moved closer. Not touching, just proximity. "When did you know?" "That you'd become this?" "The night my brother died. I was holding him, listening to him scream. And I realized that all my father's ideals, all his mercy, all his belief in human goodness had bought us nothing except graves. So you became the opposite. I became what was necessary, and you never looked back. Every day. But looking back doesn't change anything." They stood together. Two people who'd survived by becoming versions of themselves they barely recognized. On the 6th day, Ashenmore appeared. The castle rose from northern mist like something carved from nightmares and necessity. Black stone, iron gates, towers that looked built to withstand siege from gods and men equally. Serafina stared at it. "That's where we're going to live? That's home. It looks like a prison." "It is, but it's my prison, which means I control who gets locked inside." They rode through gates that opened like jaws, into courtyards where soldiers snapped to attention. Servants appeared, took horses, carried luggage, moved with the efficiency of people who understood that inefficiency around the Duke meant consequences. Carriage dismounted, turned to help Serafina down. She accepted his hand, surprised by the gesture, more surprised by how natural it felt. Captain Aldridge approached. "Your Grace, the castle's secure. No incidents during your absence. Dispatches from 3 northern lords awaiting your attention. And a delegation from Blackridge requesting audience regarding disputed land boundaries. Handle the land dispute. I'll review the dispatches tonight." "And Lady Serafina's quarters?" Carriage looked at her. "Your choice. The East Wing has guest suites. Private, comfortable, or there are chambers near mine in the North Tower." Serafina considered. "Near you. If we're maintaining the appearance of alliance, distance seems counterproductive. Practical, as always." She smiled slightly. "You say that like it's a flaw. It's not." The castle steward, the same Alara who'd served his family for decades, appeared. Studied Serafina with eyes that catalogued everything and revealed nothing. "My lady, welcome to Ashenmore. I'll show you to your chambers. Thank you." Serafina followed her inside. Glanced back once at Carriage, saw him watching with an expression she couldn't read. Then she was gone, and Carriage stood alone in his courtyard, realizing he'd just brought the one person capable of destroying everything he'd built directly into the heart of his kingdom. It was either the smartest decision he'd ever made, or the one that would finally kill him. He didn't know which, but for the first time in 10 years, he discovered he didn't care. Because isolation had stopped feeling like safety and started feeling like slow death. And maybe dying with someone who understood was better than surviving alone. Inside Ashenmore's walls, the real game was just beginning. The first 3 weeks at Ashenmore passed with deceptive calm. Serafina settled into the northern tower like she'd been born to stone and cold instead of silk and privilege. She attended council meetings Carriage held with his military commanders, sat silent through discussions of grain distribution and border patrols, absorbed the mechanics of northern governance with the intensity of someone studying an enemy's weaknesses. But she never just observed. She asked questions that made veteran soldiers reconsider assumptions they'd held for decades, pointed out supply vulnerabilities no one else had noticed, suggested diplomatic approaches to problems Carriage had been solving with threats. The castle staff watched her with cautious curiosity. This wasn't the terrified noble daughter they'd expected. This was someone who understood power from having survived its absence. Alara found Carriage alone in his study one evening, surrounded by maps and dispatch reports that painted northern territories in ink and strategic necessity. "She's dangerous," the steward said without preamble. Kedrick didn't look up. Everyone's dangerous. Not like her. The soldiers are starting to listen when she speaks. The servants ask her opinion on household decisions. She's building influence without even trying. That's why I brought her here. Alara set down the tea she'd brought. Is it? He finally met her gaze. What are you asking? Whether you're thinking strategically or feeling something you haven't felt in 10 years. Because one of those keeps you alive, the other gets you killed. Kedrick returned to his maps. I'm always thinking strategically. Then why does your face change when she enters a room? It doesn't. It does. And everyone notices, including her. The conversation ended there, but the warning hung in the air like smoke from a fire that hadn't been fully extinguished. That night, Kedrick found Serafina on the western ramparts, overlooking forests that stretched toward mountains invisible in darkness. Wind carried the smell of pine and winter that never quite left the north, no matter what season claimed the calendar. Can't sleep? He asked. She turned. Never can. Your castle makes sounds at night like it's alive. Groaning, settling, breathing. It's old. Stone shifts. Wind finds gaps. Sounds like ghosts. Maybe it is. They stood together. The distance between them had been shrinking incrementally over weeks. Not physical distance. Something else. The space people maintained when they didn't trust. When they were still calculating whether proximity meant safety or threat. I've been reading your father's journals, Serafina said. Alara gave me access to the library. Found them in a locked cabinet behind political theory texts. Kedrick went very still. Those are private. She looked at him. Are you angry? I don't know yet. He wrote about you. About Matthias. About the kind of men he hoped you'd become. Kind men. Gentlemen. Leaders who governed through inspiration instead of fear. And instead he raised a monster and got one son killed. Serafina's voice softened. He raised a survivor. There's a difference. Not one that matters. It matters to me. Why? Because I'm trying to understand. You act like your father's mercy was a fatal flaw. But reading his journals, I see someone who understood that cruelty creates cycles. That every act of violence births 10 more. He wasn't naive. He was trying to break the pattern. And he failed. Did he? Or did he plant seeds that just haven't grown yet? Kedrick turned to face her fully. What are you really asking? Whether you're capable of being anything other than what trauma made you. Whether the Duke who rules through fear is the only version of you that exists. He stepped closer. His voice dropped to something barely above a whisper. You want to know if I can change. If your presence here is somehow redeeming the monster. If love or companionship or whatever you're imagining can transform brutality into kindness. I didn't say love. You didn't have to. They stared at each other. Wind howled through battlements. In the distance, wolves called to each other through darkness that had swallowed the world beyond Ashenmoor's walls. I'm not looking for redemption, Serafina finally said. I'm looking for partnership with someone who might be willing to build something different than what came before. And if I'm not willing, then I'll leave. Go back to London. Use my father's evidence to destroy the people who destroyed him and probably get killed in the process. But at least I'll die trying to change something instead of just surviving. Kedrick felt something crack in his chest. The same fracture that had been spreading since the night he'd offered her protection in London. Since she'd looked at him and seen past the reputation to the wound underneath. Stay, he said. Just one word. But it carried weight that made Serafina's breath catch. Why? She asked. Because you're right. About the isolation. About what I've become. About the cost of ruling through fear alone. And because when you're here, the castle feels less like a prison. That's not strategic thinking. No, it's not. They moved toward each other. Not rushed. Not desperate. Just inevitable. Like gravity finally pulling objects that had been circling too long. The kiss happened in the space between one breath and the next. Soft at first. Then deeper. Carrying 10 years of loneliness and 3 weeks of proximity and the desperate relief of finding someone who understood damage from the inside. When they pulled apart, Serafina's eyes were bright. This complicates everything, she said. I know. We're both terrible at trust. Yes. This will probably end in disaster. Probably. She smiled, then kissed him again. And for one night, the Duke of Ashenmoor let himself believe that maybe survival didn't have to mean solitude. That maybe strength could include vulnerability. That maybe he could be something other than the weapon trauma had forged. It was the last peaceful night either of them would know for months. The betrayal started small. A dispatch went missing. Nothing critical, Just correspondence from a minor northern lord about timber rights. Kadrick noted it, filed the discrepancy, moved on. Then a supply shipment arrived 3 days late. The merchant blamed weather. The roads had been clear. Then rumors started filtering back from villages. Whispers that the Duke was planning increased taxes, mass conscriptions, forced relocations. None of it true, all of it spreading. Captain Aldridge brought the pattern to Kadrick's attention during a morning briefing. Someone's orchestrating this, the captain said. The missing correspondence, the delayed supplies, the rumors. It's coordinated. How many incidents? 17 in the past 2 weeks. Small enough to seem like random problems. But the pattern's there if you're looking. Who has access? That's the problem. All of these required inside information, guard rotations, supply routes, communication channels. Whoever's doing this is operating from within Ashenmoor. Kadrick felt ice settle in his gut. One of my people. Yes. How long to identify them? Unknown. They're careful, professional. This isn't amateur sabotage. Then we assume the worst. Full security review. Restrict information access. Trust no one. Sir, that will paralyze operations. Better paralyzed than infiltrated. The investigation began immediately. Soldiers were questioned. Servants interrogated. Records examined. Aldridge ran the operation with the thoroughness of a man who'd seen betrayal kill better leaders than the one he served. Kadrick threw himself into the work with obsessive focus. Cross-referenced duty rosters with incident timings. Analyzed handwriting on intercepted messages. Built a web of connections that should have pointed toward a culprit, but every thread led nowhere. Whoever was betraying him knew exactly how to stay invisible. Serafina noticed the change immediately. The way Kadrick stopped sleeping entirely. How conversations became interrogations. The return of the cold distance he'd started to shed over the past weeks. She found him in his study at 3 a.m, surrounded by papers, looking like a man at war with ghosts. You need to rest, she said. I need to find the traitor. You need to rest so you can think clearly enough to find the traitor. Kadrick didn't look up. Someone in this castle is actively working to destroy everything I've built. Every moment I waste on sleep is a moment they use to plan the next attack. And every hour you go without sleep makes you easier to manipulate. Exhaustion is a weapon. They're using it against you. He finally met her eyes. You think I don't know that? I think you're so terrified of being betrayed again that you're creating the conditions for betrayal to succeed. You're isolating yourself, trusting no one, making decisions from paranoia instead of strategy. Because paranoia kept me alive when trust got my family killed. Serafina moved closer. I'm not your enemy. How do I know that? The question landed like a physical blow. She stepped back, stared at him. Because I've had a dozen opportunities to hurt you and haven't taken any of them. Because I'm here voluntarily. Because I kissed you on the ramparts and meant it. Words are cheap. Then what would convince you? Nothing. That's the problem. There's no proof that survives real scrutiny. No action that can't be explained as manipulation. Trust requires faith. And I stopped having faith the night I watched my brother burn. Then you've already lost. Because you can't govern alone. You can't defend against enemies you can't see while suspecting everyone who might help you. You'll destroy yourself faster than any traitor could. Maybe. But I'll be the one doing it, not someone I was stupid enough to trust. Serafina left without another word. The door closed behind her with finality that made something in Kadrick's chest constrict painfully. He told himself it was necessary. Told himself isolation was survival. Told himself the same lies he'd been telling for 10 years. 3 days later, the real attack came. It started with fire. Not in the castle. In the village of Thornmere, 15 miles south. A settlement of 300 people who depended on Ashenmoor's protection and paid taxes that kept northern governance functional. The entire village burned. By the time Kadrick's soldiers arrived, there was nothing left but ash and bodies. Women, children, elderly. No one spared. The message was carved into the town square's single remaining wall in letters 3 feet high. This is mercy compared to what comes next. Kadrick stood in the ruins and felt something break that he hadn't known was still intact. Some last fragile belief that the violence he'd committed had at least protected the innocent. That his ruthlessness had purchased safety for people who couldn't defend themselves. All lies. Captain Aldridge approached with a grim expression. We found tracks, multiple riders heading north toward the border. Military trained, well equipped. How many? At least 20. Who would have the resources? Someone with significant backing. This wasn't a raid, it was a statement. Kaedric turned from the carnage. His voice came out flat, empty of everything except calculation. Send riders to every northern settlement. Full garrison alerts. I want every road watched, every village defended, every stranger detained for questioning. Sir, we don't have the manpower. Find it. Conscript if necessary. I will not have another massacre. What about the traitor inside Ashenmoor? That investigation continues, but right now we have an external threat that just murdered 300 people to send me a message. What message? That I'm not as powerful as I thought. That my protection means nothing. That everything I've built can be destroyed by someone willing to target the helpless. They returned to Ashenmoor in grim silence. Seraphina was waiting in the courtyard. She saw Kaedric's face and knew immediately something terrible had happened. How many? She asked quietly. 300. Everyone. Her hand went to her mouth. Oh God, they're trying to provoke me. Force me into retaliation that will justify a larger conflict. Turn the Northern Lords against me by making me look ineffective. Or they're trying to break you. Kaedric looked at her. I don't break. Everyone breaks eventually. The question is what you become after. He walked past her without answering. The next week descended into paranoia that infected Ashenmoor like plague. Trust evaporated. Soldiers watched each other with suspicion. Servants were questioned repeatedly. Every conversation was analyzed for subtext that might reveal betrayal. Kaedric stopped appearing at meals. Worked from his study surrounded by guards who rotated constantly so no one person had extended access. Made decisions that became increasingly erratic as exhaustion and fear compounded into something toxic. He ordered mass arrests of anyone with Southern connections. Confiscated property from families he suspected of disloyalty based on evidence so thin it barely qualified as rumor. Increased punishments for minor infractions until people were terrified of breathing wrong. The castle that had been a fortress became a pressure cooker, and everyone knew explosion was inevitable. Seraphina tried to reach him, was turned away by guards following orders. She sent letters. They went unanswered. She waited outside his study for hours. He never emerged. Finally, she forced the issue, walked past guards who tried to stop her, shoved open the door to Kaedric's study with enough force that it crashed against the wall. He looked up from maps. His face was gaunt, eyes hollow. He'd aged a decade in 2 weeks. Get out, he said. No, I don't have time for this. Make time. Because you're destroying everything you claim to be protecting. Kaedric stood. His voice rose. 300 people are dead. Someone in my castle is actively sabotaging me. And you want to lecture me about methods? I want you to see what you're becoming. You're terrorizing your own people. Creating the conditions for actual rebellion. Proving every terrible thing your enemies say about you. Because half measures don't work. Because mercy doesn't prevent massacres. Because the only language these people understand is fear. You're not talking about enemies anymore. You're talking about everyone, including me. The accusation hung between them. Kaedric's jaw tightened. If you have something to confess, now would be the time. Seraphina stared at him. You actually think I'm the traitor? I think everyone's a potential traitor until proven otherwise. How do I prove otherwise? What possible evidence would satisfy you? None. That's the point. Trust is a vulnerability I can't afford. Then you've already lost. Because you're not fighting enemies anymore. You're fighting your own paranoia. Better paranoid than dead. She moved closer, voice dropping to something barely controlled. You know what I think? I think you want to believe I'm the traitor. Because if I am, then you were right all along. That trusting anyone was weakness. That opening yourself up was a mistake. That isolation is the only defense against being hurt. Get out of my study. No. Now. Make me. They stared at each other. Two people who'd survived by becoming weapons, discovering that weapons eventually cut everyone, including themselves. Then Kaedric made a mistake. He grabbed her arm. Not violently, but firmly, meaning to escort her out. Seraphina reacted on instinct, pulled a knife from her sleeve, had the blade against his throat before either of them fully processed what was happening. The room froze. Guards rushed in, swords drawn. Everyone stopped. Seraphina and Kaedric stood locked together, her knife at his throat, his hand still on her arm, both breathing hard. You want proof I'm not trying to kill you? She said quietly. Here's proof. I've had this knife since London. Slept 3 rooms away from you for weeks. Had a dozen opportunities. Didn't take any of them. She lowered the blade, stepped back, set the knife on his desk. I'm done, she said. You want to live in a prison of your own making? Fine, but I won't be one of your jailers. She walked toward the door, stopped, turned back. Your father would be ashamed of what you've become. Not because you're strong, but because you've confused strength with the inability to feel anything except fear. Then she left. The guards looked at Carriage for orders. He said nothing. Just stood alone in his study, staring at the knife she'd left behind, realizing he'd just driven away the only person who'd seen him as something other than a monster. And he didn't know if he cared, or if he'd successfully killed whatever part of him was still capable of caring. That night, the actual traitor made their move. Carriage was in his private chambers when the attack came, not from outside, from within. Captain Aldridge entered, closed the door, drew his sword. Carriage saw it happening and felt time slow to crystalline clarity. You. Aldridge's expression carried no emotion, just the professional detachment of a soldier completing a mission. I'm sorry, Your Grace. Truly. But you've become too unstable, too dangerous. The Northern Lords decided intervention was necessary. How long? Since London. They approached me during your absence, offered terms I couldn't refuse. Money, freedom. My family held lands once. Your father seized them during his consolidation. I was promised their return. So you murdered 300 people. That wasn't me. That was other assets. I just provided information. Guard rotations. Supply schedules. Your psychological weaknesses. And the missing dispatches. The rumors. Building pressure. Making you paranoid. Isolating you from allies. You did most of the work yourself. Carriage had no weapon. Aldridge was between him and the door. 10 years of trust about to become fatal stupidity. You won't survive this, Carriage said quietly. I don't need to survive. I just need you dead. Once you're gone, your authority collapses. The North fragments, and in that chaos, actual leaders can emerge. Leaders like the ones who burned Thornmere. Leaders who understand governance requires more than fear. Aldridge moved forward. The fight was brief and brutal. Carriage was good, had trained with soldiers his entire life. But Aldridge was better, older, more experienced, fighting with the calm precision of someone who'd already accepted the cost. The sword cut across Carriage's ribs, not deep enough to kill immediately, deep enough to bleed. He went down hard. Aldridge stood over him, raised the blade for a killing strike. The door exploded inward. Serafina appeared. She'd heard the sounds of fighting, had grabbed the first weapon she could find, a poker from the hallway fireplace. She swung it like a club into Aldridge's skull. The captain dropped. Serafina didn't stop. Hit him twice more, making sure. Then she was at Carriage's side, hands pressed against the bleeding wound, her face pale but focused. You're an idiot, she said. I know. Guards. Now. She screamed for help. Soldiers flooded the chamber, saw their captain unconscious and bleeding, saw the Duke wounded, saw Lady Serafina covered in blood. The ranking soldier, a sergeant named Thorne, took command immediately. Get the Duke to his bed. Fetch the surgeon. Secure Aldridge. No one leaves this wing. They moved with military efficiency born from crisis. Carriage was carried to his bed. The surgeon arrived within minutes, examined the wound with hands that had stitched injuries worse than this during border conflicts and internal rebellions. You'll live, the man said, but you'll wish you hadn't for the next few days. This is going to hurt. He started stitching without anesthetic. Carriage gripped the bed frame and endured. Serafina stayed beside him, held his free hand when the pain got bad enough that even his iron control started fracturing. When it was done, the surgeon left instructions and departed. They were alone. I'm sorry, Carriage said quietly. For what? Everything. Suspecting you, pushing you away. Becoming exactly what you said I was becoming. Serafina's grip tightened on his hand. You're an idiot, but you're my idiot, and I'm not leaving you alone with this. Why not? I accused you of treason, because you're terrified, because trauma makes people do terrible things to protect themselves, because I understand that better than anyone. She leaned closer, and because when you told me to stay that night on the ramparts, I heard what you couldn't say, that you were tired of being alone, that you wanted something other than survival, that you were willing to try. I failed. No, you stumbled. There's a difference. Serafina moved to sit on the edge of his bed, still holding his hand, still covered in Aldridge's blood. Here's what happens now, she said. You heal. We interrogate Aldridge and find out who else is involved. We root out every traitor, and then you decide. Decide what? Whether you want to keep governing through fear or try something different, whether my father's journals meant anything or if they were just naive dreams from a dead man, whether you're capable of being more than what trauma made you. And if I'm not capable, then I'll leave, because I won't watch you destroy yourself. But I think you are. I think buried under 10 years of calculated cruelty is someone who remembers what it felt like to believe people could be better. That person died with Matthias. Maybe. Or maybe he's just been waiting for permission to exist again. Cadric looked at her. Really looked. Saw the woman who'd survived her family's destruction. Who'd endured years of humiliation and poverty. Who'd been weaponized by Lord Grey and nearly killed in London. Who'd followed him north into a castle ruled by a monster and decided to stay anyway. She was the strongest person he'd ever met. And she was offering him a chance he didn't deserve. I don't know how to be anything else, he admitted. Then learn. With me. Together. The vulnerability of it terrified him more than any physical threat ever had. But he nodded. Just once. And Serafina smiled. Over the next 3 days, the full scope of the conspiracy emerged. Aldridge broke under interrogation. Not because of torture. Because he understood the game was over and cooperation might buy leniency. 7 northern lords had orchestrated the plot. They'd been planning for months. Thornmere was supposed to be the first of many attacks designed to make Cadric look weak, to turn public opinion against him, to create conditions for his removal and the fragmentation of northern territories under their collective control. The missing element had been finding someone inside Ashenmoor willing to betray the Duke. Aldridge had been their prize recruit. Now he gave them all up. Names, locations, communication channels, financial arrangements, everything. Cadric sat in his study, reviewing the evidence with Serafina beside him. His wound ached with every breath, but the pain felt clarifying, like punishment and penance combined. We could arrest them, Serafina said. Public trials. Legal proceedings. Let justice function the way it's supposed to. That's not how the North works. Then make it how the North works. You have the authority. Use it to build something different instead of just maintaining what your father left behind. Cadric studied the names. Men he'd known for years. Some had fought beside his father. Others had sworn oaths of loyalty. All had smiled to his face while planning his murder. The old response would be execution, swift, public, brutal, a message written in blood. But that message had been failing for 10 years, had created the fear that birthed this conspiracy, had isolated him so completely that his own captain could betray him. Maybe Serafina was right. Maybe strength could look different than what trauma had taught him. Summon them, he said. All 7. Here, within the week. Tell them I want to discuss recent events. Make it clear refusal means immediate arrest. And when they arrive, we give them a choice. Trial or exile. They confess publicly, surrender their titles temporarily, submit to oversight, and they live. They refuse, they face execution for treason. That's mercy. No, it's pragmatism. Mercy would be forgiveness. This is just a different calculation. Killing them creates martyrs and destabilizes their territories. Exiling them removes the immediate threat while sending a message that I'm capable of something other than murder. Serafina looked at him like she was seeing someone new, someone he'd been once, someone he might become again. Your father would approve, she said softly. My father would be shocked I survived this long. Maybe. But he'd be proud you're trying. The 7 lords arrived within 6 days. They came expecting confrontation. Found themselves facing something worse. Accountability. Cadric held the tribunal in Ashenmoor's Great Hall. Public. Witnessed by soldiers and servants and minor nobility from across the north. The evidence was presented methodically. Aldridge's testimony. Financial records. Intercepted messages. None of the 7 could deny their involvement. When the last piece of evidence was read, Cadric stood. His voice carried through stone halls that had witnessed centuries of northern governance. You tried to kill me. Murdered 300 innocent people. Conspired to destroy the stability my family built over generations. Under traditional northern law, the punishment is execution. The 7 lords went pale. But, Cadric continued, I'm offering an alternative. Confess publicly. Surrender your titles for 5 years. Submit to crown oversight. Pay restitution to the families you harmed. Do this, and you live. Refuse, and face traditional consequences. Silence crashed through the hall. Then Lord Blackwood, oldest of the conspirators, spoke. You're serious, completely. Why? What do you gain from mercy? Cadric looked at Seraphina. She stood beside his throne. Not behind. Beside. Equal. I gained the possibility that governance can be something other than endless cycles of violence. That strength doesn't require cruelty. That maybe my father wasn't naive. Just early. Blackwood studied him. Then nodded slowly. I accept. Confession. Exile. Restitution. All of it. One by one, the others agreed. By sunset, all 7 had confessed. Surrendered authority. Accepted terms. No one died. The North witnessed something it hadn't seen in a decade. Mercy backed by strength instead of replaced by it. That night, Cadric stood alone on the western ramparts where he'd kissed Seraphina weeks before everything fell apart. She found him there eventually. They stood together in silence. Then Seraphina spoke. You did it. Did what? Changed. Chose something different than what trauma demanded. Cadric shook his head. I just chose tactics with better long-term outcomes. You can tell yourself that. But I was watching your face during the tribunal. You weren't calculating. You were hoping. Hoping that maybe showing mercy would prove your father right. That maybe you could be something other than the monster. He looked at her. And if I fail, if this weakness gets more people killed, then we'll face it together. But Cadric, yes? What you did today wasn't weakness. It was the hardest form of strength. Because it required believing people can change. That includes yourself. She took his hand. And for the first time since his brother died, Cadric Vale allowed himself to believe that maybe survival didn't require becoming something inhuman. That maybe the boy his father had raised wasn't completely dead. That maybe, with someone beside him who understood both the damage and the possibility of healing, he could build something better than what fear had created. It wouldn't be easy. The North would test him. The conspirators might betray the mercy he'd shown. And the part of him that had learned to survive through ruthlessness would fight every soft impulse. But for the first time in 10 years, he wasn't facing that fight alone. And that made all the difference. The tribunal's mercy bought Cadric 3 weeks of fragile peace. Then the crown sent its army north. The message arrived at dawn, carried by a royal messenger whose horse had been ridden nearly to death. The seal was unbroken, the wax still warm. Cadric read it once in the cold morning light streaming through his study windows, then read it again to make sure exhaustion wasn't distorting the words. It didn't help. The content remained the same. Duke Cadric Vale was hereby summoned to answer charges of sedition, unauthorized clemency toward convicted traitors, and obstruction of crown justice. Failure to appear within 14 days would be considered an act of rebellion. An expeditionary force of 2,000 soldiers was already marching north to ensure compliance. Seraphina found him still holding the letter an hour later. She'd learned to read his silences. This one carried the weight of everything they'd been building collapsing before it had time to take root. How bad? She asked. The kings decided my mercy was weakness. Wants me brought south in chains to answer for showing clemency to the conspirators. And if you refuse? War. She moved to stand beside him at the window. Below, Ashenmoor's courtyards were filling with morning routines. Soldiers drilling, servants hauling water. Children from the nearby village playing near the outer gates. Normal life happening in the shadow of violence that hadn't arrived yet, but was coming with the inevitability of winter. What are you going to do? Seraphina asked. Cadric set the letter down. His voice came out flat, empty of emotion because emotion would make the calculation impossible. I have 3 options. Go south and face trial, which means execution disguised as justice. Fortify Ashenmoor and fight, which starts a civil war that kills thousands. Or run. Abandon everything and disappear. You're not running, no. And you're not surrendering, no. Then you're choosing war. He finally looked at her. I'm choosing survival. Again. Like I always do. No matter what it costs. The bitterness in his voice cut deeper than any blade. Seraphina took his hand. You showed mercy because you believed people could change. The king's punishing you for that belief. If you respond with the violence he expects, you prove him right. That mercy was a mistake. That you're exactly the monster he needs you to be to justify destroying you. So what's the alternative? Let his army march in unopposed? Allow myself to be arrested and executed while you watch? No. You fight, but not the way he expects. Meaning what? She turned to face him fully. Use the evidence. My father's evidence. The corruption records that implicate half the crown's inner circle. Release it publicly. Force the king to defend against accusations instead of prosecuting yours. Make this about his legitimacy instead of your defiance. Kedrick stared at her. That's political suicide. You'll become a target for every lord whose crimes you expose. I've been a target since I was 16. At least this time I'm choosing the fight. They could kill you. They could kill both of us. But we'll die having tried to build something better than endless cycles of violence. Isn't that what your father would have wanted? My father's dead because he tried to build something better. Mine too. Maybe it's time we finished what they started. The words hung in this cold morning air between them. Two survivors who'd spent years running from their father's legacies finally deciding to embrace them. Kedrick made the decision that would define everything. Send riders to every northern lord, tell them the crown's coming and why. Tell them I'm not surrendering, and tell them I need their answer within 3 days. Stand with me or stand aside. No middle ground. What about the evidence? We start leaking it immediately. Small pieces. Enough to create chaos in London while the army's marching north. Make them fight 2 battles simultaneously. Serafina nodded, then leaned forward and kissed him, hard, desperate, like people kiss when they're not sure they'll survive long enough to kiss again. When they pulled apart, she said quietly, "No matter what happens, you chose right, mercy over fear, hope over cynicism. Your father would be proud." He pulled her close, held her like she was the only solid thing in a world that had turned to quicksand beneath his feet. If we die together. Obviously. I didn't survive this long just to miss the ending. The writers went out within the hour. The evidence began trickling into London by noon. Serafina had organized it brilliantly. Small releases to different sources, newspapers, town criers, anonymous letters to prominent ministers, each piece carefully selected to implicate different members of the king's circle, creating paranoia, making everyone suspicious of everyone else. By evening, early reports were filtering back through merchants traveling north. The capital was in chaos. Accusations flying, lords demanding investigations, the King Zhao owning emergency councils. The distraction was working, but the army kept marching. 2,000 soldiers commanded by General Marcus Thorne, a career military officer known for brutal efficiency and absolute loyalty to the crown. He'd put down rebellions in the west, crushed uprisings in the southern provinces. Never lost a campaign. His orders were simple. Bring Duke Vale south, alive if possible, dead if necessary. The northern lords' responses started arriving on the second day. Lord Blackwood sent 300 soldiers and a message that said simply, "You gave me mercy. I give you loyalty." Lady Garrett from the Eastern Territories sent cavalry and a letter detailing exactly how much she'd hated the king's taxation policies. Lord Pemberton, who'd tried to lure Serafina to her death in London, sent nothing. His silence spoke louder than words. By the third day, Kedrick had assembled a force of 1,800 men, well-trained, familiar with northern terrain, motivated by something more complex than orders. Some came for loyalty, others for self-interest. A few because they believed in the possibility that governance could be different than what they'd known. It wasn't enough to match the crown's force in open battle. But Ashenmore wasn't built for open battle. It was built for siege. Captain Thorne, Aldridge's replacement, spread maps across the war room table. He was younger than his predecessor, harder, a veteran of border conflicts who'd learned command through survival rather than noble birth. "They'll arrive within 4 days," he said. "General Marcus will expect us to meet them on the field. Try to prevent them reaching the castle. That's doctrine." "So we do the opposite," Kedrick said. "We let them come, draw them close to Ashenmore's walls. Then we make them bleed for every foot of ground." "Siege warfare favors defenders," Thorne agreed, "but only if we can hold long enough for the political situation in London to collapse. If the king's circle turns on itself before Marcus breaks through, we win. If not, starvation and disease do his work for him. How long can we hold? Months if necessary. We have stockpiled grain, wells inside the walls, and winter's coming. Marcus's supply lines will be exposed to northern weather while we're fortified." Serafina studied the maps. "What about the villages, the settlements outside Ashenmore's protection?" That was the calculation Kedrick had been avoiding. "They're vulnerable," he said quietly. "Marcus will use them as leverage. Threaten civilians to force our surrender. So we evacuate them. Bring everyone inside the castle walls." Thorne shook his head. "That's 1,500 additional people. Women, children, elderly. They'll consume resources and create security risks." Kedrick looked at Serafina. saw in her eyes the same question his father would have asked. Are we protecting the North or just ourselves? The answer defined everything. Send riders, he ordered. Every settlement within 20 miles evacuates to Ashenmoor. Bring livestock, grain, whatever they can carry. We defend everyone or we defend no one. Sir, that's strategically an order, not a debate. Thorn nodded, understood it without agreeing. Yes, Your Grace? The evacuations began immediately. Families poured through Ashenmoor's gates over the next 2 days. Farmers with carts loaded with possessions. Craftsmen carrying tools. Children wide-eyed with the adventure of it until they saw their parents' faces and understood this wasn't a game. The castle swelled with humanity. Every corridor filled, every chamber occupied. The courtyards became temporary housing. Fires burned day and night to feed everyone. The organized military fortress transformed into something chaotic and alive. Cedric watched it happen from the ramparts and felt the weight of every life now depending on decisions he'd make in the coming days. This wasn't abstract governance anymore. These were real people with names and families and futures that would end if he failed. Seraphina joined him as sunset turned the northern sky blood red. Having second thoughts, she asked. About which decision specifically? All of them. He almost smiled. Every single one. But it's too late for doubt. She leaned against the stone wall beside him. Do you remember what you said the night we met? That you govern through competence. That mercy invites predators. I remember. Do you still believe that? Cedric looked at the people filling his castle. Survivors who trusted him enough to abandon their homes. Who believed the Duke of Ashenmoor would protect them even if it meant fighting the crown itself? No, he said quietly. I believe mercy invites humanity, and humanity is what we're actually defending, not territory, not power. The possibility that governance can mean protection instead of domination. Your father would recognize you now. Maybe. Or maybe I've just finally grown into the man he was trying to raise before trauma turned me into something else. Seraphina took his hand. Tomorrow they arrive. Tomorrow we find out if idealism can survive contact with reality. They stood together watching darkness consume the northern forests, knowing this might be the last peaceful moment either of them experienced, knowing that by this time tomorrow, everything they'd built might be burning, but neither of them was running, not anymore. The Crown's army appeared on the fourth day exactly as predicted. 2,000 soldiers in perfect formation, cavalry on the flanks, infantry in the center, supply wagons stretching back for miles, banners flying the king's colors, sunlight catching on armor and weapons until the entire force looked like a dragon made of steel and violence. General Marcus Thorne rode at the front. 53 years old, scarred from 2 decades of campaigns. He studied Ashenmoor's walls through a spyglass and saw exactly what he expected. A fortress, heavily defended, prepared for siege. What he didn't expect was the crowd. Civilians lined the battlements, hundreds of them. Women holding children, old men who remembered wars from their youth. They weren't armed, weren't threatening, just present, visible. Human shields that complicated every tactical option. Marcus lowered the spyglass and spoke to his second-in-command. Vale's protecting civilians. That means he's committed to defense. No sally attempts, no night raids. He'll hold position and dare us to assault walls filled with innocents. So we starve them out, the lieutenant said. No, we negotiate first. The king wants Vale alive if possible. Dead dukes become martyrs. They establish camp half a mile from Ashenmoor's outer walls, close enough to communicate, far enough to prevent surprise attack. Tents appeared with military efficiency. Cooking fires were lit. Sentries posted. Within hours, the Crown's army had transformed empty fields into organized occupation. At sunset, a herald approached under flag of truce. Cedric received him in Ashenmoor's main hall, the same chamber where he'd held tribunal for the conspirators, where he'd chosen mercy over execution. The herald looked around nervously at the armed soldiers lining the walls. General Marcus Thorne requests parley, the herald announced. Tomorrow at dawn. Neutral ground between the armies. He guarantees your safety. Cedric studied the man. Young, scared, just following orders. Tell the general I accept. But not neutral ground. He wants to talk. He comes to my walls. I'm not leaving Ashenmoor. The herald swallowed. Sir, that's highly irregular. Those are my terms. He can accept them or start his siege. The man fled. Seraphina appeared from a side entrance. You're forcing him to negotiate on your territory. Smart. Or suicidal. Hard to tell the difference anymore. What will you offer him? Nothing. He's here to demand surrender. I'm here to refuse. But the conversation buys time. Every day we delay is another day for London's chaos to grow. And if he attacks, then we defend. And people die. Probably a lot of them. She moved closer. I have an idea. Tell me. Let me negotiate. Cedric stared at her. Absolutely not. Listen. Marcus expects you. The brutal duke defending his fortress. But what if he faces me instead? The disgraced daughter whose father's evidence is destroying his employers? I can offer him something you can't. What? A way out. Proof that the crown he's serving is rotten, that following orders means defending corruption. I can give him moral doubt. He'll arrest you on sight, not if I'm under formal parley protection, and not if I'm making him question whether executing you serves justice or just protects the king's criminals. It's too dangerous. Everything's dangerous now, but I'm the one weapon Marcus won't expect. Let me use it. Cedric wanted to refuse. Every instinct screamed to keep her behind walls where armor and soldiers could protect her. But she was right. She was the piece that didn't fit Marcus's tactical expectations. And unexpected pieces changed games. Fine, he said. But you're not going alone. I'll be on the walls. And the moment anything seems wrong, we pull you back. Serafina smiled. Deal. Dawn broke cold and gray over Ashenmoor. The parley was arranged at the base of the castle's outer walls, close enough to the gates that archers could provide cover, far enough that it felt like neutral territory. General Marcus arrived with an escort of 10 soldiers, professional, alert, hands near weapons but not threatening. Then Serafina walked out alone. She dressed deliberately, not as a noble lady, not as a refugee, as something between. Simple dress, no jewelry, hair pulled back, looking like someone who'd survived enough to understand what survival actually cost. Marcus's expression flickered with surprise, then hardened into professional neutrality. They faced each other while 2 armies watched. Lady Serafina Evercott, Marcus said, I was expecting the Duke. The Duke sent me. I speak with his authority. You're the one releasing evidence against the crown. I'm the one revealing truth about corruption that's infected the government for decades, including the conspiracy that destroyed my family. That's sedition. That's justice. Marcus's jaw tightened. I'm not here to debate philosophy. I have orders to return Duke Vale to London, alive if possible, and I'm here to tell you those orders serve men whose crimes are now public record. You're being used to protect conspirators who've stolen from the crown they pretend to serve. Prove it. Serafina pulled papers from her sleeve, carefully folded documents sealed with wax. Read these. Cross-reference with the evidence already released. You'll find names, amounts, treason dressed as legitimate governance. She tossed the papers to the ground between them. Marcus didn't move. His soldiers did. One retrieved the documents, handed them up. The general read. His face remained impassive, but something changed in his eyes. Even if this is true, he said slowly, I have orders. Orders to defend corruption? Orders to execute a duke whose only crime was showing mercy to convicted conspirators? Orders that make you complicit in the same treason you're supposedly here to prevent? Careful, Lady Serafina. Accusing me of treason is dangerous. I'm not accusing you of anything. Yet, I'm offering you the chance to choose between blind obedience and actual justice, between serving orders and serving the realm. Marcus stared at her. A man whose entire career had been built on following commands, who'd never questioned whether the orders were just, who was suddenly facing the possibility that he'd been a weapon aimed at the wrong targets his entire life. What are you proposing? He asked carefully. Walk away. Take your army back to London. Demand investigation into the evidence. Force the king to address the corruption openly. Be the general who chose integrity over expedience. And if I refuse, then you lay siege to a fortress filled with civilians. Kill people whose only crime was seeking protection. Become the villain in a story that history won't forgive. You think I care about history? I think you care about honor. And there's no honor in what you're being ordered to do. Marcus was silent for a long moment, the weight of decades of military service pressing against the possibility that those decades had been built on lies. Finally, he spoke. I need to consult with my officers. You have until sunset. The parley ended. Serafina walked back through Ashenmoor's gates while soldiers on both sides processed what they'd just witnessed. A negotiation that had turned into something else. An accusation. An offer. A grenade thrown into the certainty of military hierarchy. Codric met her inside, pulled her close. That was either brilliant or insane. Both, probably. What if he attacks anyway? Then we made him hesitate first. Doubt kills certainty. Certainty is what makes soldiers willing to die for orders. They waited. The day stretched into afternoon, into evening. Sunset approached with agonizing slowness. On Ashenmoor's walls, defenders watched the Crown's camp for signs of preparation. Attack formations, siege equipment being positioned, anything that indicated Marcus had made his decision. But the camp remained still. Too still. Something was happening, but it was invisible. Then, just as sun touched horizon, a rider emerged from the Crown's encampment, carrying a white flag, heading toward Ashenmoor at speed. Cedric received the message personally. It was sealed with Marcus's personal crest. He broke the wax, read words that would either save them or damn them. General Marcus Thorne to Duke Cedric Vale. I require 24 hours to verify evidence presented. During this time, I'm declaring unilateral ceasefire, no hostile action from either force. If evidence proves accurate, I'm prepared to discuss alternative resolutions. If evidence proves false, siege begins immediately. Your response required. Cedric looked at Seraphina. He's actually considering it, or he's buying time to position for attack. Only one way to find out. Cedric wrote his response, accepted the ceasefire, sent the rider back. The night that followed was the longest of his life. Sleep was impossible. He walked Ashenmoor's ramparts, listening to the sounds of two armies occupying the same geography without fighting. Unusual. Unnatural. The silence of violence held in check by pure will. Seraphina found him at midnight on the western tower. Can't sleep either, she asked, thinking about what happens if Marcus accepts. If he actually walks away. If mercy and truth are enough to prevent war. That's what we've been fighting for. I know, but I spent 10 years believing it was impossible, that only violence prevented violence. And now we're hours away from proving my father was right all along, that there's another way. Scared? Terrified. Because if this works, it means everything I became was unnecessary, that I chose brutality when other options existed, that I'm responsible for deaths that didn't have to happen. Seraphina took his hand. Or it means you learned. That trauma taught you one lesson, but you were brave enough to unlearn it when evidence suggested a better path. Growth isn't betraying who you were. It's becoming who you're capable of being. They stood together in darkness. Below, two armies waited for dawn. And somewhere in the Crown's encampment, General Marcus Thorne sat alone in his tent, surrounded by evidence of corruption so vast it implicated nearly everyone he'd served under for 2 decades. Reading names he recognized. Amounts that could have fed entire provinces. Treasonous acts disguised as policy. He thought about his oath, his honor, his career. He thought about the Duke who'd shown mercy to conspirators when execution would have been easier. He thought about the girl who'd stood alone between armies and offered him a choice. And slowly, over the course of that long night, Marcus made a decision that would change everything. Dawn arrived with fog thick enough to hide armies from each other. Cedric stood on Ashenmoor's highest tower, Seraphina beside him. Captain Thorne and the Northern Lords assembled behind, everyone watching this gray void where the Crown's encampment existed invisible. Then the fog began lifting, and what they saw made every breath catch. The Crown's army was moving, but not toward Ashenmoor. They were withdrawing, tents being struck, supply wagons turning, soldiers forming march columns heading south, the entire force executing an organized retreat. At the front, General Marcus Thorne sat mounted on his warhorse. He raised one hand in salute toward Ashenmoor's walls. Then he turned his army and marched away. The silence on Ashenmoor's ramparts was absolute. 2,000 people processing the impossible. They'd won without fighting. Mercy had worked. Truth had mattered. Everything Cedric's father had believed. Everything he died trying to prove. Everything Cedric had spent 10 years rejecting. All of it validated in a single morning. Seraphina grabbed his hand. Her voice came out choked. You did it. We did it, he corrected. Around them, soldiers and civilians began cheering. The sound built from whispers to roar, echoing off stone, carrying across fields. A celebration of survival that had seemed impossible hours earlier. But Cedric didn't cheer. He stood watching the Crown's army disappear into distance, and he understood with crystalline clarity that this wasn't the end. It was the moment before the real storm arrived. Because General Marcus might have been convinced, but the king hadn't. The corrupted lords hadn't. The entire structure of power that depended on Cedric being a villain hadn't. They just lost their army. lost their certainty, lost the narrative that justified destroying him. And desperate people with everything to lose were the most dangerous enemies of all. Caedric turned from the ramparts. His voice cut through celebration. "Captain Thorne, sir. Double the sentries, triple the scouts. I want eyes on every road within 50 miles. The captain's expression shifted from celebration to professional alertness. "You think they're coming back?" "No. I think something worse is coming." Marcus walked away because he believed we were right, but belief doesn't change politics. The king's inner circle just watched their general refuse orders. They're cornered, and cornered predators don't surrender. They lash out. Seraphina's hand tightened on his. "What are you saying? That we won the battle? But the war's just beginning, and this time they won't send an army we can see coming. They'll send something else, something surgical, something designed to kill the problem before it spreads. Meaning you, meaning both of us." The celebration continued around them, but Caedric and Seraphina stood at its center like stones in a river of relief, understanding what everyone else would learn too late, that mercy had saved them from one threat, but created a dozen more. And the real test was coming, not of their ability to survive, but of their willingness to keep choosing hope when every instinct screamed to embrace the violence that had protected them before. Somewhere in London, in a chamber filled with desperate lords whose crimes were now public, a new plan was being formed. Not an army, something worse. And Ashenmoor's walls wouldn't protect against what was coming next. The assassins came on the 7th night after General Marcus withdrew. Not an army this time, just 12 men who understood that surgical precision killed more effectively than overwhelming force. They wore no colors, carried no banners, moved through northern darkness like smoke given human form and lethal intent. They breached Ashenmoor's outer walls at midnight, using ropes and grappling hooks that made no sound against stone worn smooth by centuries. Bypassed sentries through timing so precise it suggested inside knowledge. Someone had sold the patrol schedules. Someone always did when the price climbed high enough, and the cause seemed lost enough. The first indication of danger was a guard's throat being cut in the eastern tower. No scream, just the wet sound of steel parting flesh and a body hitting stone with the finality of all endings. The second guard managed to ring the alarm bell twice before a crossbow bolt punched through his chest and silenced him permanently. By then, the assassins were already inside. Caedric woke to bells and chaos, threw off blankets, grabbed the sword he'd started keeping beside his bed since London, moved toward the door wearing only sleep clothes and the instincts that had kept him alive through a decade of threats, both overt and hidden. Seraphina was already up, fully dressed. She slept in clothes now, had learned the same lesson he had. That survival meant being ready for violence at any moment. That the space between sleeping and dying could be measured in seconds if you weren't prepared. They met in the corridor outside their chambers. Her hand found his in darkness, broken only by torchlight flickering from wall sconces that cast more shadow than illumination. "How many?" she asked. "Unknown. But they got past the walls. Inside job." "Has to be." The sound of fighting echoed from somewhere below. Steel on steel, screaming, the symphony of violence that Caedric had learned to interpret like music. He could tell from the acoustics this wasn't a full assault. Too concentrated, too surgical. "They're coming for you," Seraphina said. "Us. They're coming for both of us." Captain Thorne appeared at the end of the corridor leading 6 soldiers moving in tight formation. His face was grim in the half-light. "Your Grace, they've breached the inner keep. Professional killers. We've lost 8 men already. Where are they headed?" "Here. They're cutting through anyone between them and your chambers. We need to move you to the safe room." The safe room was a fortified chamber deep in Ashenmoor's foundations. Built during his grandfather's time when betrayal and siege were seasonal occurrences rather than exceptional threats. Stone walls 3 feet thick, iron door, single entrance that could be defended by 2 men against dozens. It was also a tomb if the assassins controlled the castle above. Caedric made the calculation instantly. How many men can you spare to defend the safe room? 4. Maybe 6. The rest are needed to contain the breach. Not enough. They'll bottle us up and wait us out. Then what do you suggest? Caedric looked at Seraphina, saw his own understanding reflected in her eyes. They'd survived this long by refusing to be predictable, by choosing the option enemies didn't expect. "We fight," he said. "That's suicide," Thorne said flatly. "Hiding slower suicide. They planned this assuming we'd fortify and defend. We do the opposite. Hunt them while they're hunting us. Take back initiative. You're not a soldier anymore. You're the Duke. Your life is worth more than... My life is worth exactly what I'm willing to risk it for. And right now, that's everyone sheltering inside these walls because they trusted me to protect them. Serafina squeezed his hand. I'm with you, obviously, he said, trying for lightness, achieving something closer to desperation. Where else would you be? Literally anywhere safer. Where's the adventure in that? They moved through Ashenmoor's corridors like ghosts learning to hunt ghosts. Cedric took point with Captain Thorne. Serafina stayed close behind with 2 soldiers flanking. The remaining guards spread out to protect civilians and contain the breach. The castle had transformed into a maze of shadows and sudden death. Every corner was potential ambush. Every sound could be enemy movement or just wind through arrow slits. Cedric's heart hammered against ribs that still ached from Aldridge's blade. Sweat mixed with the cold air that turned breath visible. He'd fought before. Led soldiers during the rebellions that followed his father's murder. But this was different. This was personal violence in intimate space. The kind where you saw eyes before you killed, where death smelled like copper and fear. They found the first assassin in the Great Hall. He'd been wounded by guards, bleeding from a leg wound that had slowed him enough to be cornered, but cornered predators were still predators. He held a short blade in one hand and a throwing knife in the other. Professional stance. Zero fear. Cedric approached slowly, sword raised. The assassin watched him with the detached interest of someone who'd already accepted death and was just negotiating the terms. Who sent you? Cedric asked. The assassin smiled, blood on his teeth. Does it matter? You made enemies. Enemies paid gold. We came north. Same story as always. Names. Lots of names. Lords whose corruption you exposed. Ministers who need you dead before investigations begin. Maybe even the king himself. When you're this hated, patronage gets complicated. How many of you? The man's smile widened. Enough. Then he threw the knife. Not at Cedric, at Serafina. Captain Thorne moved faster than thought, knocked the blade aside with his sword. The assassin lunged forward using the distraction. Got 3 steps before Cedric's blade took him through the heart. The man died still smiling, like he'd accomplished something just by getting close. They moved on, left the body where it fell. No time for ceremony. No space for processing the reality that Cedric had just killed a man at close range and felt nothing, except the practical concern that 9 more like him were still breathing somewhere in his castle. The second encounter happened near the kitchens, 2 assassins trying to flank their position. The fight was brief and brutal. Captain Thorne took one down. A guard named Marcus handled the other. Both assassins fought with the skill of men who'd done this professionally for years. Both died anyway because skill meant nothing when you were outnumbered, and your enemy was fighting for more than gold. 7 left. The hunt continued through spaces Cedric had walked thousands of times, but which now felt alien and hostile. His own castle turned labyrinth. Every familiar corridor transformed into potential killing ground. They found 3 more assassins near the North Tower, defending a position that made no tactical sense until Cedric realized what they were actually doing. Buying time. While the others completed the real mission, his blood went cold. The children, he said. They're targeting the families we evacuated. Captain Thorne's face went pale. The Eastern Wing, where we housed the civilians. They ran, speed over caution, taking stairs 3 at a time, bursting through corridors without clearing corners first. Every second mattered, because every second meant more innocents dying. They reached the Eastern Wing to find it already under attack. 4 assassins, moving through rooms where families slept. Systematic execution of anyone they found, creating terror that would paralyze resistance, making an example that would echo across the north for years. Cedric saw a child, couldn't have been more than 7, standing over her mother's body, too shocked to scream, just staring with eyes that had learned what horror looked like. Something in him shattered, not the calculated brutality he'd wielded for 10 years, something older, deeper, the part of him that had watched his brother burn, that had built walls from trauma and called them strength, that had convinced himself ruthlessness was the only language worth speaking. All of it cracked apart, and what emerged was different, not softer, not gentler, clearer. He moved with precision that had nothing to do with mercy and everything to do with absolute commitment to stopping this, not for political reasons, not for strategic advantage, because there was a child standing over her mother's body, and someone needed to pay for putting that expression in her eyes. The first assassin went down before he realized Cedric was there. Sword through the kidney, dead before hitting ground. The second managed to turn, got his blade up, died anyway. Cadric fought with the efficiency of someone who'd stopped caring about survival and started caring about completion. The third and fourth assassins coordinated their defense. Professional, skilled. It didn't matter. Captain Thorne took one from the side. Serafina appeared from nowhere and drove a dagger into the other's throat with precision that suggested she'd learned violence from the same schools that had taught Cadric. Then silence crashed through the eastern wing. Bodies on the floor. Civilians emerging from hiding. Children crying. Adults trying to process how close death had come. Cadric stood in the center of it, breathing hard, covered in blood that belonged to other people, looking at the child who'd watched her mother die, and understanding with brutal clarity that this was the cost of everything he'd built. Every decision, every compromise, every moment he'd chosen power over humanity. This was where it led. To children with dead parents and trauma that would follow them forever. Serafina touched his arm. "We need to check the rest of the castle." He nodded. Couldn't speak yet. Couldn't trust his voice not to break under the weight of what he was feeling. They moved through Ashenmoor's remaining spaces, found 2 more assassins, killed them without ceremony. By dawn, all 12 were dead. The castle was secured, casualties counted. 8 guards killed, 14 civilians murdered, including the child's mother. The price of surviving another night. Cadric stood on the ramparts as sun rose over the northern forest, painting everything in light that felt obscene given what had just happened. Serafina found him there eventually. She'd cleaned the blood off, but her hand still shook. Delayed shock. The body's way of processing violence after adrenaline faded. "We won," she said quietly. "Did we? We're alive. They're dead. That's winning." Cadric turned to face her. His voice came out hollow. "I spent 10 years telling myself that ruthlessness prevented this, that fear kept people safe, that the violence I committed protected the innocent from worse violence. And tonight I watched a child stand over her mother's body. Because my enemies are so desperate to kill me, they're willing to murder anyone near me. That's not your fault, isn't it? I'm the one who exposed the corruption, who chose mercy over execution, who made powerful people desperate enough to hire assassins willing to kill children. So what are you saying? That you should have executed the conspirators? That mercy was a mistake?" He looked at the sunrise, at the castle filled with survivors who'd trusted him, at the future he'd been trying to build from the ruins of his father's idealism. "I'm saying I don't know anymore. I thought choosing differently than trauma demanded would break the cycle. But maybe there is no breaking it. Maybe violence just breeds more violence, no matter how carefully you try to escape it." Serafina moved to stand beside him. Her hand found his. "That's exhaustion talking. And grief. You're looking at one night and using it to judge years of work. 14 people died tonight, and hundreds are alive because you chose to protect them. Thousands are alive because you've governed the North with increasing humanity instead of pure brutality. One night of horror doesn't erase years of progress. Tell that to the girl who lost her mother. I can't, but I can tell you that her mother chose to come here, chose to trust you, made that decision knowing the risks. Because she believed Ashenmoor was safer than staying vulnerable in a world where powerful men settle scores with civilian blood." Cadric's shoulders sagged. "I'm so tired. Of fighting, of calculating, of trying to be something better than what I was, and failing anyway." "You're not failing. 14 bodies say otherwise. 14 bodies say your enemies are terrified, that the changes you're making threaten them enough that they're resorting to assassination. You must be doing something right if they're this desperate to stop you." He looked at her. Really looked. Saw someone who'd survived everything thrown at her and was still standing, still fighting, still believing that better was possible even when current reality suggested otherwise. "How do you keep going?" he asked. "After everything. The betrayals. The losses. Tonight. How do you not just give up?" Serafina was quiet for a long moment, then spoke with the weight of someone who'd asked herself the same question countless times. "Because giving up means they win. Every lord who destroyed my family, every conspirator who hired those assassins, every person who profits from keeping the world brutal and hopeless. If I surrender to despair, I'm validating their worldview, proving they were right that mercy is weakness and idealism is fatal stupidity. And if they are right, then we'll die having tried to prove them wrong. But at least we'll die as humans instead of as weapons. At least we'll know we refuse to let trauma have the final word on who we became." The sun continued rising. The castle below began stirring with the routines of survival. Cooking fires, children's voices, The sound of people rebuilding after horror, because that's what people did when the alternative was surrendering to darkness. Kaedric pulled Seraphina close, held her like she was the only thing preventing him from fragmenting completely. Maybe she was. Maybe that's what partnership meant, being the structure that held when everything else collapsed. I need to bury them, he said. The people who died. Properly. With honor. I'll help. And I need to find whoever inside these walls sold us out. Someone gave those assassins our patrol schedules. Someone betrayed us. We'll find them. And then I need to address what happened. Publicly. Acknowledge the cost. Not hide behind strategic necessity or claim their deaths served some greater purpose. Just admit that people died because I made enemies, and that has consequences. That's leadership, Seraphina said softly. The kind your father would recognize. Or the kind that gets me killed next time. Maybe. But at least you'll die as someone who acknowledged the human cost of power, instead of someone who treated casualties as acceptable losses. They stood together as morning claimed Ashenmoor. Two survivors who'd learned the hardest lessons about violence and were slowly, painfully learning even harder lessons about how to live with what violence demanded. The funeral happened 3 days later. 14 graves on a hillside overlooking the castle, marked with stones carved with names, attended by hundreds of people who'd known the dead, who understood that these weren't statistics. These were mothers and fathers and children whose absence would echo through families for generations. Kaedric stood at the front, spoke words that felt inadequate but necessary, acknowledged responsibility without hiding behind justification, promised to honor their memory through continued commitment to building something worth their sacrifice. The crowd listened in silence that felt heavier than any accusation. When it ended, individuals approached, some to thank him for protecting them, others to rage at him for bringing danger to their families. A few to simply stand close and shared grief that needed no words. The child who'd lost her mother came last. Her name was Anna, 8 years old, being raised now by an aunt who looked almost as broken as the girl. They stood before Kaedric with eyes that held questions he couldn't answer. "I'm sorry," he said, which was all he had. "Sorry for your loss. Sorry my enemies killed your mother. Sorry the world is cruel enough that children have to learn about death this way." Anna looked at him for a long moment, then spoke with the clarity of someone who'd aged years in a single night. "Will you stop them? The bad men?" "I'll try." "Promise?" He knelt to her level, met her eyes. "I promise. Not because I can guarantee success, but because I'll spend every remaining day trying." Anna nodded, like that was enough. Like promises from dukes meant something when delivered with honesty instead of political calculation. They left. Kaedric stayed kneeling in the grass, felt the weight of that promise settle into bones already carrying too much. But it didn't feel like burden. It felt like purpose. The kind that came from understanding what you were actually defending. Not territory, not power, not legacy. People. With names and families and futures that depended on whether leaders chose brutality or humanity. Seraphina helped him stand eventually. The mourners had dispersed. They were alone on the hillside, with 14 graves and a sunset that painted everything in colors too beautiful for how much they hurt. "I found the traitor," she said quietly. "Who?" "A servant named Marcus. He was being blackmailed. They had evidence his son committed crimes in London. Threatened execution unless he provided information. Is he in custody?" "Yes. Awaiting your judgment." Kaedric looked at the graves, thought about Marcus the servant, about the impossible choice between betraying his employer or watching his son die, about how many decisions in life were just choosing which terrible outcome to accept. "Release him," Kaedric said. "What?" "He was coerced. His son was threatened. Yes, people died because of his betrayal, but executing him doesn't resurrect them. It just creates more casualties. The lords will say you're weak, that traitors need to face consequences. The lords can say what they want. I'm done governing through fear of appearing weak. Marcus gets released with a warning. His son gets protection from whoever was blackmailing him. We break the cycle of threat and counter-threat. Or we're no different than the people we're fighting." Seraphina studied him. "This is what change looks like. Messy, complicated. Refusing easy vengeance even when it feels deserved. Is it working? I don't know yet. Ask me in 10 years." They walked back to Ashenmoor through twilight that softened the castle's harsh edges. Inside, life continued with the resilience that defined humanity. People adapted, found joy in small moments, rebuilt after horror because the alternative was surrender. Over the following weeks, something shifted in the north. News of the assassination attempt spread. Also spread was Ceadric's response. The burials with honor, the acknowledgement of responsibility, the mercy shown to the coerced servant, the continued commitment to governing through humanity instead of fear alone. It created ripples. Not immediate transformation, not sudden peace, but small changes that accumulated into something larger. Villages that had feared Ashenmoor started sending delegations. Lords who'd remained neutral began offering tentative support. The northern territories started functioning less like occupied territory and more like confederation. In London, the political situation continued deteriorating. The evidence Serafina had released created investigations that toppled ministers and bankrupted noble houses. The king found himself defending his inner circle instead of prosecuting Ceadric. General Marcus, true to his word, became a voice for reform within military ranks. Slowly, painfully, the possibility emerged that the North might actually survive as something other than a fortress ruled by fear. It was spring when the letter arrived from the king. Formal invitation, not a summons, requesting Ceadric's presence in London for discussions about northern autonomy and potential formalization of his authority. Written in language that suggested negotiation between equals rather than monarch addressing subject, Ceadric read it 3 times, trying to find the trap. Serafina found him in his study, surrounded by correspondence that mapped a future neither of them had dared imagine 6 months earlier. "Is it real?" she asked. "Or another trick?" He set the letter down. "I think it's acknowledgement that I'm not going anywhere, that the North is stable under my governance, that fighting me costs more than accepting me. So you won. We survived. That's not the same as winning. Close enough." Ceadric looked at her, at the woman who'd stood beside him through assassination attempts, and political warfare, and the slow, painful work of rebuilding himself into something resembling the man his father had hoped to raise. She'd changed too. Was less guarded now. More present. Like proximity to someone learning humanity had taught her she could risk being human too. "Come with me to London," he said. Not as strategy, not as alliance, as my wife. The proposal landed in the quiet of his study like a stone dropped in still water. Serafina's breath caught. "That's not tactical." "No, it's terrifying and probably stupid and completely necessary." "Why?" "Because I don't want to do this alone anymore. Because you're the strongest person I've ever met, and I want to spend whatever time I have left learning from you. Because somewhere between paranoia and mercy, I fell in love with you, and I'm tired of pretending that's a weakness instead of the best decision I've made in 10 years. She crossed the space between them, took his face in her hands, looked at him with eyes that carried everything they'd survived together. "Yes," she said. "Obviously, yes. Where else would I be?" They married in Ashenmoor's chapel 3 weeks later. Not a political ceremony, not a dynastic merger. Just 2 people who'd survived impossible odds, making promises to face whatever came next together. The northern lords attended. The castle staff filled the remaining space. Children from the evacuated villages sat in front rows. Anna, the girl who'd lost her mother, was there with her aunt. She smiled when Ceadric and Serafina exchanged vows. Small gesture, but it felt like absolution he hadn't earned but was grateful to receive anyway. That night, they stood together on the western ramparts where they'd first kissed, where everything had begun shifting from survival to something approaching actual living. Serafina leaned against him, her head on his shoulder. "We're going to have children someday." Terrifying thought. Why? Because I have no idea how to raise people in this world. How to teach them strength without teaching them cruelty. How to prepare them for violence without making them violent. She was quiet for a moment, then spoke with the wisdom of someone who'd thought about this extensively. "We teach them what we learned. That trauma doesn't have to define you, that power is most legitimate when it serves others, that mercy and strength aren't opposites, and that the hardest battles are the ones fought against our own worst instincts. And if we fail, then we fail having tried, which is better than not trying and guaranteeing failure." Ceadric pulled her closer. The stars above Ashenmoor burned with indifferent beauty. The northern forest stretched into darkness that had witnessed centuries of violence and would witness centuries more. But inside the castle, lights glowed warm, families slept safe. Children dreamed of futures that weren't dictated by fear. It wasn't perfect, would never be perfect, but it was better than what came before. And better was the only victory that mattered. Years later, when historians wrote about this period, they would struggle to explain what happened. How a duke known for ruthlessness became known for balanced governance. How the North transformed from militarized territory into something approaching actual community. How two broken people built something functional from their shared damage. But the explanation was simpler than they wanted to believe. Caedric Vale learned what his father had known, but hadn't survived to teach. That strength without humanity was just sophisticated brutality. That fear maintained power, but never built anything worth maintaining. That the hardest form of courage was admitting you were wrong, and choosing differently despite every instinct screaming otherwise. He learned it slowly, painfully, through mistakes that cost lives and decisions that haunted him. But he learned, and in learning, he became the leader his father had believed was possible. Not perfect, not unblemished, but committed to something larger than survival. Committed to the radical idea that power existed to protect rather than dominate. That mercy was strength, that vulnerability could be weapon and shield simultaneously. It wasn't the ending anyone expected, but it was the ending both Caedric and Seraphina had earned through every brutal choice and every moment they chose hope over cynicism. Years later, standing in Ashenmoor's courtyard, watching their children play, where soldiers once drilled for war, Caedric would reflect on the journey that brought him here. From the boy who watched his brother burn to the man who chose to build something better from the ashes. Seraphina joined him, older now, gray threading through dark hair, laugh lines around eyes that had seen too much horror and somehow still found reasons to smile. Regrets? She asked. Thousands. But none about choosing you. None about choosing mercy over fear. None about believing my father was right even when everything suggested otherwise. That's growth. That's exhausting. She laughed, took his hand. The children's voices carried through air that smelled like spring and possibility. Ashenmoor stood solid behind them. Not a fortress anymore. Just home. And somewhere in the halls his father had walked, in the chambers his brother had died trying to protect, Caedric felt their presence like benediction. Approval for finally becoming the man they'd believed existed beneath the trauma. He'd never fully escaped what he'd been. The brutal duke who ruled through fear. The survivor who'd mistaken cruelty for strength. Those versions lived inside him still. Ghosts that whispered in difficult moments. Urges he fought daily. But he'd learned to recognize them, name them, choose differently than they demanded. And in that daily choice, repeated through years that became decades, he built something his father would have recognized. Not perfect, never perfect, but human. Flawed and trying and committed to the belief that better was possible if you were willing to pay its price. The sun set over Ashenmoor. Children were called inside for dinner. Seraphina squeezed his hand once before heading toward the castle. Caedric lingered a moment longer, watching shadows claim the northern forests, feeling the weight of years and choices, and all the lives that had intersected with his. Then he turned and followed his wife inside, toward warmth and family and the future they'd built from ruins, toward the kingdom not of fear or power, but of people who'd chosen to believe that survival wasn't the only victory worth claiming, toward home.